Presenting today, please turn your mic on when you begin speaking and off when you've completed your remarks. For all presenters, please state your name for the record before speaking or responding to questions. And our first item is a briefing on our homelessness response system. I will turn it over to Jillian Shoney.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Jillian Shoney, Director of the Homelessness Response System. So today we are going to provide very brief highlights on the policy and program work that is represented in the Homelessness Response Action Plan. Then before we get to data, I would like to remind everyone sort of how we got here being the place where we are able as staff to better guide the investments of this body and the Portland City Council. No other elected bodies before you have had the comprehensive data set that we have today and the degree to which it allows us to connect your policy and budget choices to outcomes. Next slide. So brief update and highlights of some of our policy and program level work. A quick reminder, this is how the current iteration of our plan is structured. My apologies, Tasia, next slide. There are 90 action items across 16 strategies organized into 5 goal areas. Next slide. After completing more than 65 distinct action items under the first version, we immediately went to work at the beginning of this calendar year to tackle the new and expanded action items under the revised plan. We've completed 5 and have 49 underway. Next slide. Of those in underway status, the vast majority are on track without concern. 7 are close to completion, and that just usually means we're trying to track down sort of final documentation so we could put it in our database. And then 8 are dependent on budget decisions for this fiscal year, so we put those on in sort of a holding status, and then 1 is flagged for further review. So things are going well. Next slide. And then I'm just going to speak to a few items that sort of garner more attention than others, and also ones that demonstrate the action plan is bringing together all jurisdictions and partners that hold roles and responsibilities within the homelessness response system. So first, I'll highlight 311, that is work led by the COO's office to explore any additional opportunities to draw down Medicaid funds, including for permanent supportive housing. As was reported out in our implementation committee yesterday, we should have some reports in about a month or so. 413, similarly, in our work to connect healthcare and housing, Health Share of Oregon is taking what we call our combined data set, that match between HMIS and Medicaid claims data, and performing an analysis of those currently in PSH and seeing what we can learn. That work is well underway and now includes our neighboring counties, Washington and Clackamas. So we'll have a regional lens on those investments to elevate to the new Regional Policy Oversight Committee as well as to Metro Council. So really excited about that work and what we can learn about PSH. 422 is a result of Commissioner Moyer's amendment last budget cycle and subsequent board letter to the state in December. We now have a work group to figure out the puzzle that seems to exist regarding getting individuals with severe and persistent mental illness the care they need and deserve via the 1915 I and K waivers. Next, 113, of great interest to many of you, is figuring out what it means whenever you are funding or hearing about case management. We have an inventory tool out the door to every single internal and external partner, including contracted partners, to gather what everyone is actually doing when they say they are providing case management. From there, we'll establish some definitions and standards that will likely reveal more work to come by the COO's office. But at a minimum, the goal is for you to know more clearly what you are funding when a program or a contracted partner is performing case management. A couple more. 412, given the high acuity needs of our houseless neighbors, we have a work group led by Metro focused on medically enhanced shelter and respite beds that includes our health system partners. This is an example of how we have Metro lead on aspects of the system that need a regional lens on them. And of course, the medically enhanced shelter conversation pulls in the context that VMO will likely be coming offline come July 1, so we're planning for that. And finally, 131, what we call the Reentry Hub, is wonderful work led by MCSO. As of last week, there was a dry run where outreach workers and other service providers now come inside the jail for those who are being discharged immediately upon release or after arraignment. The goal is service navigation, asking folks what they need, and making that referral right then and there, and also confirming the service connection. Very excited about that work. Next slide. So I was compelled to give a quick history lesson about how we got to this point where we are able to come to you and project outward the impact of your investments at a system level. Next slide. We're one behind, but that's my fault, Teja. Next slide again, please. Okay. Prior to the county being the administrator of HMIS, I think everybody's well aware that the city was the administrator. It was in January of 2023 that discussions of a transfer to the county began. Parallel to that, discussions related to the HRS IGA took place, and in January 2024, the first set of agreed upon key performance indicators were in effect, but they were largely at the strategy and program level. In March of 2024, the HUD approval came through for the official transfer of HMIS from the city to the county, so that took place. And then the work to shift from relying solely on the point-in-time count to a comprehensive by-name list, grounded in national best practices and, quite frankly, reality, continued, and in April 2025, the new by-name list dashboard was released and is now updated monthly. Believe it or not, there are cities across the country that I talk to that are really, really jealous of this work and how far we've come. And then finally, in December 2025, the expiration of the original KPIs came and went, and the adoption of new system-level KPIs took their place. Next slide. Why does all of this matter? Because shifting from the PIT count to a by-name list allows us to set system-level key performance indicators that represent a framework for a long-term investment strategy. An investment strategy that must begin this fiscal year and carry forward year after year. This is what it will take to fund a system that is designed and funded to end the homelessness of more individuals, not just shelter them. Next slide. Just a visual reminder that your budget votes this fiscal year will set the July 1 baseline from which we will set goals and define the outcomes and outputs departments incorporate into contracts and then carry out the work to help our community members. Before you, with the fiscal year 27 budget, the opportunity is to set us in the right trajectory. Next slide. And next slide after that. Repeating a bit of what we shared last week for inflow. This is the bridge into the data part of the presentation. We look at overall trends, how many people are new to our system each month compared to the overall investments in imminent prevention work, and specifically the changes in those investments from one fiscal year to the next. In other words, if inflow numbers are on an upward trend and we cut our eviction prevention investments, we project generally that inflow will get worse. Conversely, if inflow were roughly to stay the same, but we increase our eviction prevention investments, we would estimate generally that inflow would decrease. And I think y'all know that inflow will always be the biggest caveat in our work, as we largely don't have direct control over it. So always keep that in mind. Next slide. Projecting outflow is different, much more straightforward. We know that for about $13,000, our average cost per housing placement, you increase our outflow by 1. So we can estimate with higher confidence how your investments will influence outflow. So if a person is in one of our shelters on Wednesday and we house them on a Thursday, it's 1 for 1 from our homelessness count directly off our by name list and to our housed count. Next slide. So right now, as I've said before, our system is not financially sustainable, it is not balanced, and not focused enough on actually ending the homelessness of more individuals and families. We can't get there in one fiscal year, especially in a cuts year, but we can begin to set ourselves on a better trajectory that over time will create the effective, balanced, and reliable homelessness response system we need here in Portland and Multnomah County. With that, I'll pass it to Ryan.
Good morning. For the record, my name is Ryan Dybert. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Director at the Homelessness Response System. If we can move to the next slide. These slides should look familiar to the board since we shared them initially last week during the joint session with City Council. Today, we're going to review that series of scenarios that we shared last week to help estimate the impact of a range of funding decisions before you. And in each scenario, as Jillian said, we start with the current data from our by name list. We project a range of estimated outcomes for the total number of people experiencing homelessness through the next fiscal year, based on changes in levels of effort to address inflow and outflow. Over the past week, we've also done some additional work to estimate how those shifts would combine with proposed changes in shelter capacity to estimate how each scenario specifically might impact unsheltered homelessness moving forward. So we'll try to address both of those, and that'll be the new piece for this conversation. I will say that it's been more difficult to make those estimates of unsheltered homelessness, especially because right now the mayor's still considering a range of scenarios for potential shelter cuts on the city side. How many and what type, one night only versus 24/7 shelters, make a fairly big difference in terms of how this could play out. But even with that uncertainty, we've prepared some estimates based on our best assumptions, at a minimum to give you a sense of potential trends. So we'll thread those in throughout. Together, I think they point to a pretty clear picture, which is that even in tough budget years, how you choose to program our limited system resources actually makes a pretty big difference in overall outcomes. So even if you don't have any ideal choices, some look better than others, and we'll talk through that. So reminder that in each of these graphs that we're going to go through here, each of the red bars reflects actual data from our by name list, looking at the total number of people experiencing homelessness in Multnomah County measured each month for the past 2 years. Remember that within this picture, there's a really dynamic picture of thousands of people moving in and out of homelessness each month. It's definitely not a static population, but with inflow outpacing outflow, the overall numbers have grown each month, and that's the curve that you see in this trend. So the first scenario that we review here on this slide assumes that we continue with essentially the same level and mix of investments in shelter prevention and housing placement that we have in our current fiscal year. With that mix of resources, over the past 16 months, we've seen about a 32% increase in our by name list overall, and a 52% increase in the number of people known to be unsheltered within it. That's been in the midst of multiple years now of shelter expansion. So again, because the by name list comes directly from service utilization records, some of the increase that you see here reflects expanded access to services. But when inflow so consistently outpaces outflow, and a lot of our shelter expansion is in shelters that don't have clear pathways to housing, it's not surprising that we continue to see people cycling from shelter to shelter and back to the streets. Okay, so when you project the current investments from this fiscal year forward, the general estimated trend, which is represented here by the black line, continues on the same general course, with the by name list growing by hundreds of people each month and totaling several thousand additional people experiencing homelessness over the next 2 years. We estimate that under this scenario, at the close of the next fiscal year, we would still see roughly a 25% increase in the total population of people experiencing homelessness compared to our most recent data from February, and a roughly 40% increase in the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness within that. So again, nearly all of that increase is due to inflow outpacing outflow, which would continue at the same accelerated rate that we currently see. Shelter capacity stays steady in this scenario, but we estimate that unsheltered homelessness would increase by roughly 3,500 people by the close of the fiscal year. So if we can go to the next slide. Yep, exactly. And I'll recap those at the end as well when we lay all the scenarios out next to each other. I'm glad to say, though, that the mayor and the chair have both proposed better scenarios than the status quo, even in the midst of tough budget choices. So again, in this graph, the status quo is represented by the black line again, and then the combined estimated impact of the proposed executive budgets on both the city and the county side are represented by the blue line. Even with the revenue constraints that we face in fiscal year 27, these budgets propose moving toward that more balanced system by cutting some shelter resources while adding resources to prevention and housing placement work. And you can see the meaningful change in the trajectory with that blue line. So we begin to bend the curve, that's the good news, but with constrained resources, we still don't beat inflow. So that said, you actually, in these proposals, would effectively cut the difference between inflow and outflow roughly in half compared to the status quo investments. That's a much better outcome, especially with fewer resources. When you look at that through the lens of estimated impacts specifically to unsheltered homelessness, though, the question becomes, do those improvements to inflow and outflow make enough of a difference to offset the immediate term reductions in shelter? And the short answer is yes. So the proposed administrative budgets do result in a reduction of our existing shelter capacity, but they also increase our effort on prevention and placement. So even within this coming fiscal year, we estimate that that slows the increase in total population enough that it more than offsets the lost shelter capacity. So by the end of the fiscal year, we estimate that roughly 1,850 fewer people would be experiencing homelessness compared to the status quo, including roughly 450 fewer people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Again, this is what it looks like to rebalance our system in the right direction, even if it's not fully resourced for maximum impact. If we could go to the next slide. Then, of course, your decisions don't have to end at the executive budget proposals. You've charged us to help you think about how you can do more. We want to help you consider some additional scenarios. And specifically, we want to illustrate how you can both increase the level of effort on the front end in prevention work and on the back end in housing placement to affect this estimated trajectory. So we described this scenario in the joint session. This scenario that we graph here isn't hypothetical, actually. Since the chair filed her proposed budget, the Department of County Human Services did some additional work to estimate what it would take to draw down more Medicaid-funded housing stabilization and eviction prevention money from the one-time health-related social needs waiver. That's a federally funded Medicaid money that's carved out to support people on the Oregon Health Plan who are facing both health and housing instability. The program started under Oregon's most recent Medicaid waiver, and it's due to expire in September of 2027. So in that sense, this is use it or lose it, likely one-time state resource, and DCHS is pretty sure that we can use more of it here in Multnomah County in its last year. So if DCHS were to hire 3 more limited duration FTE at a total cost of about $300,000, they think it would give them the capacity to draw down an additional $7.8 million in Medicaid housing stabilization and prevention assistance for eligible households that they otherwise wouldn't have capacity to serve. So we estimate here that the subsequent reduction in inflow further bends the curve beyond the current proposed budgets should the county board amend the budget proposal to unlock the additional federal resource. Again, status quo's black line, proposed executive budgets are blue, and the dashed yellow line shows the estimated impact of the additional Medicaid stabilization and prevention spending.
Can I ask a clarifying question about
Sure.
that particular program? That particular program can also do some level of eviction prevention, correct? You can pay back rent
Yep.
and do
Utility.
rent and utility. Okay,
Yep.
yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I've got one too. How many FTE and how many households are predicted to be served?
It's 3 FTE, and I can get back to you on the specific number of households.
Yeah, let me see if I can find that.
Thank you.
Yep. So again, when you look at this scenario, even with the yellow dashed line, inflow is still outpacing outflow for the year, but it's down to about a quarter of the monthly rate compared to the status quo. So again, movement in the right direction. So next slide, and this is the last scenario. So last, we wanted to demonstrate a scenario that builds on that additional Medicaid-funded prevention resource and adds an additional $5 million in investment in housing placement beyond the current proposed budgets. So that scenario is represented here as the green dotted line. Combined, we estimate that those actions would draw us nearly even inflow to outflow on the year. It would shift us from year to year increases of people experiencing homelessness in the thousands, instead to increases in the hundreds. In several of the months during the fiscal year, you might see outflow actually outpacing inflow. And on average across the year, people newly becoming homeless might outpace the number leaving homelessness by closer to 30 people each month compared to our current rates around 300. So you knock that inflow-outflow mismatch down to about 1/10 of what we see currently.
What are the assumptions that the city will do based on this in their budget?
So the assumptions are based on the current mayor's proposed budget, and that includes new investments in both prevention, placement, and continuing some shelter. So in this scenario, we estimate that by the end of the fiscal year, you'd see nearly 3,000 fewer people experiencing homelessness compared to the status quo, including roughly 1,300 fewer people experiencing unsheltered homelessness compared to the status quo. Again, that's even when we're accounting for the proposed reductions in shelter capacity. So you'll remember that all of the outflow-focused housing placement interventions are also scalable. For every $5 million that you invest, it's reasonable to expect that you can increase annual outflow by 300 to 400 people, pushing both total and unsheltered homelessness down accordingly. We estimated in this scenario that you'd need to increase housing placement investments by roughly $11 million beyond the executive proposed budgets to get to net neutral inflow versus outflow. And investments beyond that $11 million could actually bend the curve negative. So again, in all the scenarios that we've shown you today, you still have far less revenue to work with compared even to last year. And that's in a system in which inflow is already outpacing outflow. So in all of these scenarios, without additional revenue, you can't fully bend the curve. Inflow still wins. And every scenario is estimated to result in at least some net increases in homelessness within the fiscal year, including in unsheltered homelessness. But you do have smart options in front of you to minimize those increases, to make measurable differences in how an extremely tough budget year plays out across our community. So again, the gap between the black line and the blue line here, status quo versus the proposed budgets, represents 1,850 fewer people estimated to be experiencing homelessness at the end of the next fiscal year, including 450 fewer estimated to be experiencing unsheltered homelessness, even with fewer shelter beds in operation. And then the gap between that black line and the green line represents 3,000 fewer people estimated to be experiencing homelessness at the end of next fiscal year, including 1,300 fewer estimated to be experiencing unsheltered homelessness. So we'll go just to the last summary slide. This slide was trying to summarize some of the range of scenarios we just covered in less numerical and more conceptual terms, especially as you think about the impacts on unsheltered homelessness. In the interest of time, though, today I'm going to skip some of the details and summarize more broadly, just by saying your current scenario is a really challenging one. You've got insufficient local revenue to fully resource an ideal system, especially given increasing inflow pressures. And those are largely driven by external economic factors and state and federal policy choices and funding cuts that you don't control. There are no ideal choices heading into this year, but as we look at the estimated outcomes based on our best data, I do think there are some clear choices. On the one hand, you can preserve shelters at the expense of investments that would decrease inflow and increase outflow. That would continue us on the trajectory toward what's described here as the least effective scenario, one where you underinvest in both preventing inflow and increasing outflow, and instead focus on infinitely expanding shelter to meet growing levels of unsheltered homelessness. It's neither fiscally sustainable nor good for the people or the communities that we serve. On the other hand, you can make difficult reductions in shelter to improve inflow and outflow balance, to bend the curve in the right direction, even if we're not fully resourced to reverse the overall growth in homelessness in a single year. So that puts us on the path toward that more ideal system, which helps make experiences of homelessness in Multnomah County rare, brief, and one time. So I think we're going to end on that point, and unless Jillian has anything to add, move to questions and discussion.
No, just to answer Commissioner Singleton's, it's about 950 more people for a total of 2,400 people over the next fiscal year that DCHS would help through that program.
All right, actually, let me say, people, households,
Households.
thank you.
Are we concerned about the available housing inventory to make these placements?
That's a fantastic question. I will tell you that with the city and some of the tables we have focused on housing production and the vacancies, like we are able to track vacancies in regulated units, which are, so affordable housing, 60% and less, and there's about 1,600, about 700 of those are in the Home Forward portfolio. But there are other vacancies out there. I don't know, I don't have an estimate off the top of my head, but I guess I should have just answered yes, because, I mean, housing production, turns out we're really far behind, and we have decades of work ahead of us to the tune of billions of dollars, and we need 20,000 just in the 0 to 30 income range, which is what would reduce inflow. So it's a problem. I should have just said it's a problem.
And that's
It's a problem.
It was very, but that's just in Multnomah County, right? Those
Yes.
numbers? Yeah.
Yes.
So I think if we look region-wide, which I think we need to as we're talking
Yes.
about housing, because we know that people don't always, live
Yeah.
in one certain, and so that's why I think it's really important that we continue, of course, having the conversations with the city, but also with Metro and the state in terms of what's the need for our entire region. So thank you.
Yeah, our housing connector tool that HSD has been piloting for a couple of years should be a regional tool.
Yeah.
And similarly, I'll say that, as you look at these scenarios, they're based on math. There is a difference between math and the real world, and the work that, you'll see this reflected in the Homeless Service Department budget presentation coming up. But, even in the proposed budget scenario, the existing executive proposed budgets, I think we're looking at roughly doubling the level of housing placement over the course of the next fiscal year compared to this. So you start to run into real capacity constraints with our community-based partners as well as with housing supply. And continuing to hear the direct input from those providers about how they can balance those increases in scale is a really important piece of connecting the math to the reality.
It might be good on the other side of budget to have PHB and Prosper, or no, it wasn't Prosper, BPS come share some of what they're working on that they did at the last SOC meeting. I think understanding where the county can plug in would be helpful for the wider board to know just all the different moving pieces they have, because some's about land banking, which is a great investment strategy. But again, that's something that's bigger than just City of Portland.
Yep. And we had a really good exchange with those folks at the last Steering and Oversight Committee meeting. The video is worth reviewing if you want to, and we would be happy to bring that into more of a joint session context.
Shockingly, I had a few questions. I do want to just update a budget note, or a budget amendment that I had that gets a little bit at the eviction prevention. So I had been proposing what is more like an eviction prevention in-reach team based on Central City Concerns model. Folks have seen this. I've just added the pay-fors in this. But part of the model is that it would be drawing down this benefit the Medicaid benefit that we're talking about. Currently, it's not slated to serve quite as many households. It's a few less FTE, but I think it's worth doing some work together to figure out how close we are to there if additional is needed.
Okay.
At the joint city-county meeting the other day, I asked for a graph on the unsheltered, the KPI number 8, which is relating to the sheltered homelessness, and I'm not seeing that in here, and so I got numbers, but I'd like to see the actual.
The reduction of the 450 and yeah, we can put that in graph form, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it, getting down to by name to understand what's going to be happening, because I'm pretty sure if we close 700 beds, it's going to have there's going to be a big ripple effect. And I think we should see what impact that's going to have.
Yeah.
The other, so if we.
Right, but as Ryan shared, and maybe we dwell on this a minute, because it is of high interest, like, we're going to see a net reduction in unsheltered homelessness regardless of the shelter cuts.
I'd like to see the graph, because
Okay.
we're closing, if there's 700 beds, almost 700 beds closed, I'd like to see what we're predicting, because from a just high level, when we were presented with here are the KPIs, here are the goals, that was one of them, and I'd like to see what the impact is on that, because we do know that shelter provides safety off the streets, access to basic services. So I think it's an important metrics to have, not just the overarching one to drop it off.
And we, not having that graph included in this packet is just the mismatch between when we had to file these slides for council and coming here today. So
Great. So if you could just
I
go
at
to a
least
separate-
tried to get the into words, and we'll get it into some graphics.
Great, I appreciate that, thank you. I also, just for those who have been watching the Metro measure and paying attention to sort of what some of the promises made to voters, there was always the population A and population B, and this presentation doesn't mention either of those populations. I'm just curious if you could speak to that.
So none of the modeling that we've done, the estimations that we've produced this year, gets to that level of detail. So which of these interventions is primarily serving Pop A versus Pop B, and how would we expect that to shake out? And for folks following at home, I think it's easiest to think of population A as folks who have experienced long periods of homelessness and have significant disabilities. That's the population that SHS was primarily intended to serve. Population B are those households with shorter experiences of homelessness, primarily driven by economic factors. So I can't tell you with any detail how that would split out in these estimates. In general, though, what I'll say is when we talk about the impacts of housing placement-focused interventions, that roughly $13,000 a household, you're looking at a mix in that kind of a number of population A and population B that would be served through that kind of an intervention. It's primarily what we'd call rapid rehousing, as opposed to like permanent supportive housing.
So generally, this is a generalization, but generally the investments in prevention would be the impact, not those who are chronically homeless because they're not homeless. Again, I'm thinking about what was presented to voters and equipment. It would be, I think, important for us to understand in the modeling what impact the additional investments in the front end have on both populations. So, are we actually making investments that are going to be helpful for those who aren't in the chronically homeless bucket? And so we still have a very large chronically homeless population, and what are the strategies for that? So it would be helpful to get that separated out again, just so we can see the data related to that.
And I think it's fair to say that that's going to be the next iteration of this kind of work. We're actually in the process right now working with the Homeless Services Department to try to bring in some additional capacity to help us with more complex modeling like that. that looks at different interventions for different populations and can get a little more granular. So I would say next act to come, and it likely won't be within the context of this year's budget discussions.
You say it will be or won't?
Won't be. Yeah, that level of detail to be able to suss out is going to take a lot more work.
What about the investments we're making this year? What populations those will be focused on?
That's, I think, a really good question to bring into the Homeless Service Department discussions today, because they actually break into much more detail where those dollars are proposed to be used.
So my other question, slide 11, it's the how they all relate.
Yeah.
My understanding was when we had our earlier discussions about adopting the KPIs and goals, which I was uncomfortable doing because it was just blanks in the goals, was that we were going to be, it was going to be shared with the commission that sort of based on this level of investment from the chair's budget, here's what we actually can produce. And I think what I heard you say when you were on this slide is that's going to be like decided later. But my understanding was we've had the chair's budget introduced, and that then you'd be able to say, with these investments, here's what our goals are.
You're going to set the baseline. So Tasia, could you bring up slide 27? So just by way of reminder, what we will do, so we have the KPIs in place. Five of them require specific goals. The final slide, sorry, I guess it's 20. Thank you. What we will do in a few weeks is pull what we're calling the preliminary report. That will just show you sort of where we are at in the context of all 12 KPIs. Then you're going to make your budget decisions, and you're going to set the baseline for where we start come July 1, and it will be based on that baseline that the SOC will make goal recommendations for the 5 that require specific goals. We have to know the level of effort first before we can set responsible goals.
But don't you have a prediction of what the level of effort is from the chair's budget?
Yeah,
I
and you
mean,
see that, yeah.
You know, the assumption would be the commission approving the chair's budget. So that seems like, can't we predict what the level of effort would be based on the chair's budget? I mean, versus the commission is being asked to approve a budget that doesn't actually, that is just setting a baseline, which that doesn't seem like that was what was presented. It was more, once we know what the investment are, and the assumption is it's the chair's budget for now, that based on that, we can set the goals, not we're going to set them in the future.
So we're going to set the goals once the budget is final.
Yeah, I think
Well, but
I think
we
staff
know
has been really
generally what the
clear.
budget is.
But I do think that staff was really clear at the onset when we had our joint city-county meeting that it's up to the commission and the council to really tell them what the goals could possibly be based on the budgeting decisions that were made. And yes, I think like both the mayor's budget and my budget, well, I know my budget for sure took into consideration some of these investments and what impact they would have on the different parts of our system to help bend the curve, as some of the slides showed earlier. But ultimately, it's up to the council and this commission to make the final budgeting decisions that are going to have the impact on that. That's why this new report is going to be important, so that as we're making the final decisions, we know what that impact is going to be. But it was always, I mean, I just appreciate the realism with which the goals are trying to be based, because it's really about like, hey, you need to put the dollars into the system in this way in order to actually have that impact that we want to see.
I could set a goal right now, but it would probably result in it being an unfunded mandate like the community sheltering strategy. It's not hard to set goals. But I want them baked into reality.
You all are recommending investments, so it seems like that would be, if you're recommending investment, assuming the commission, you recommended investment to the chairs make decisions out there, based on that, what would the goals be? because it seems like, well, we would just be picking a number. I want to know, like, based on all the individual investments and the program offers, what the actual goal for this year would be. And you spoke to some of them, but it's actually not, are those goals or those predictions?
What I would say is, we're trying to present you in the context of the budget decisions that you're making with some reasonable estimates. They're not going to be perfect, but they at least help you understand the orders of magnitude, so that you can really set that floor through your budget decisions for what those goals could be. So for instance, if you were to, like, based on the estimates that we've been able to put together, if we were to set goals right now, based on the executive proposed budgets from each side of the river, it would be unrealistic to set a goal that would show a net reduction in homelessness, because the resources aren't sufficient to be able to produce that based on our estimates. So then we will have discussions with the Steering and Oversight Committee to look at that within the context of how much can we reasonably shift it within this fiscal year, given our actual budget realities, and then how much do you want to push in the goal setting for further changes in future fiscal years. And that'll start to set markers for not just where we're going this year, but where we're headed after that. And I think that's where you can get into more of the back and forth that I think you're implying and maybe hoping for.
Yeah, I guess I don't understand the goal setting to be like setting a baseline, because we have a baseline from already, right? I mean,
We want a baseline within the budget, the actual budget that y'all will vote on June 4th. That's what we're going to set the baseline off of, and then have goals.
Why would we already have a baseline. It's the work that we've done in the past.
Yeah, and if you look at the graph, the status quo baseline, let's call it, because I think we're using that term differently, is really bad. We need to begin to bend the curve. And so,
Well, obviously, I've been talking about that for 3 years. In fact, frankly, we just have the data, but I guess I don't understand why we're just saying the data is going to set the baseline. We know what
the
the
budget.
base. It's not the baseline of individuals. It's
So I think, as an example, budget amendments are already in play that would change either DCHS investments, HSD investments on different ends of this inflow and outflow. And so frankly, spending time right now setting goals on the chair's budget, we're already proposing changes to that.
Yeah.
So to me, it feels like busy work, and I don't know that it adds value for me in moving into those next steps, because I think, to your point earlier, the community sheltering strategy set goals that were never funded to be able to actually sustain shelter in the long term, and I don't want to repeat those mistakes.
Yep.
That's exactly my point. I want to know what the chair's budget does, and if we have any amendments, the impact it's going to have, because it was never presented, and frankly, I was there, that was never presented. We are not going to fund the inflows. In fact, there was a chart that had, we're going to have a 26% increase in flow-through, but there never was like, we're not investing in that. So I would like to know what the prediction of with the chair's budget, so it looks like we have this, but also on the other KPIs, and what impact any amendments would have. Because I'm going to just go back again. I was here during the whole community sheltering strategy, and it was a formula of, we have this much shelter capacity, and we increase the flow through. Nobody ever said, but we're not going to fund the flow through. That wasn't presented. And then now it's like, oh, we didn't fund that. So I'd like to know, like, what is it that we're, either through the chair's budget, and this isn't busy work, this is frankly the work of what I think our broader community expects, is like, how will the investments that we make either through the chair's budget or through amendments impact both unsheltered homelessness and sheltered?
Okay, we're almost out of time for this presentation because we still have the HSD, so I want to make sure everybody has a chance to get some of their questions asked for HRS.
Mine is you don't need to answer this now, nor do I think you could. I'm really interested in the graphs around various degrees of bending the curve. If you can pull out by certain demographics, I have some concerns that, frankly, based off of not entirely just the city's reductions, but that we are having a disproportionate reduction on culturally specific providers, and that we are kind of narrowing the system in a way that is not safe and/or inviting for all people. So I'm just kind of curious about, like, if I could get a look at how we project subgroups, how the curve might, I don't know if it's a big enough data set to do that or not, but if you can run it by subgroups just to see.
Yeah, and HSD will be able to speak to that during their presentation,
thank
Commissioner.
you.
So,
I do want to put out a budget note because it's a part of the slides that you all shared. Commissioner Moyer is co-sponsoring this with me. It's about PSH services. So this would require you all plus departments with permanent supportive housing to conduct an analysis of services compared to a Fidelity scale. The idea is to get together with experts who are running the programs to understand which Fidelity scale to use. It's kind of 6 in one, half dozen in the other between the Pathways and the SAMHSA scale. You all get to decide what that looks like. And to assess to see where we're actually doing PSH and where we're not funding services, as well as then looking at what would be the additional cost to fully fund PSH and start implementing that work to Fidelity in our community.
great, and follows nicely the PSH analysis that we're doing. A nice suite of
Yep,
resources to look at.
exactly.
Thank you.
Great. Commissioner Jones-Dixon, did you have any questions?
Yeah, just a handful of questions. One, the presentation was extremely helpful, was online for the whole thing. Wanted to know, how are you working independent of the work that the Spark unit is doing? And then the reason why I asked, I continue to think about just like the wraparound services or the additional services that we could provide to folks that are unhoused and what have you. That's my first question.
Wait, which project?
The strategic plan, the work that Sam's leading through Spark and
Yeah.
continues.
Our plan feeds up into the county strategic plan. So they took some of our KPIs and incorporated them rather than duplicate that work. So anyway, they worked really well with us. It was great.
And there's really direct overlap in and intentionally so, in some of the components of work. So for instance, the survey that we're doing to understand case management across the enterprise, that's closely tied to both of those bodies of work.
I can tell from the verbiage and everything that you're using.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. And then other thing I wanted to flag, it's just I'm looking forward to the report in a few weeks as well. That's going to be helpful as far as the overall investments. I appreciate you flagging just the difference, the impacts as far as rapid rehousing versus shelter. So it'll be good to just have a better understanding. It's helpful when I'm sharing that information with our city managers and the providers out in East Multnomah County. And then I had an opportunity to shadow Steve Ciccotelli and the folks that were doing the reentry work last week.
Yeah.
It was a game changer. So looking forward to, we'll likely be bringing forth an amendment to fund that work moving forward. So I'm extremely hopeful. This is extremely useful as well. So thank you for your efforts and your work.
Well, thank you for your advocacy around the reentry hub. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Great. Thank you all very much. Just appreciate the presentation, and we'll may have some follow-up questions for next week, but just appreciate the good work that's happening. Thank you. All right, now we are moving on to the second, and I was wrong. This is not the 5th budget work session. This is the 6th budget work session. So, yeah, I mean, I am counting. So our next, I am counting. Our next item is on the Homelessness Services Department. Homeless Services Department. I would invite them to come down, and we have a very special guest today. our new director of our Homeless Services Department, who is here in person. So can't wait to greet him and welcome him to the county. All right. So welcome, Nathaniel, and welcome to all our guests and speakers who are here today for our Homeless Services Department budget. I know, Nathaniel, this is your second day, so I appreciate you diving right into the difficult work of the budget. I was talking with Chris earlier, who was remembering his second day where he also had to come and sit before during budget. So it's always an exciting time to join the county. I will say that I'm really looking forward to this discussion. There are a lot of tough decisions with a $67 million deficit. The Homeless Services Department had the largest deficit to deal with during this budget process, and so we're going to need to really be strategic and good conversations about investing in the continuum of homelessness services for people who are experiencing homelessness to really get some solutions. So with that, I will pass it over to you, Nathaniel.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair Vega-Peterson and fellow commissioners. For the public, I'm Nathaniel Vergao, the Director of the Homeless Services Department. I use he, him pronouns, and as mentioned, I am on day number 2. Hour number 11. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll quickly walk you through the agenda and then make a real brief intro. I'll do a quick intro. I'm going to turn it over to the Community Budget Advisory Committee. Then we'll do an overview of the budget, a general overview, and then by division, a quick review of additional considerations, and then broad area for questions. We do want to, section by section, allow questions so that you don't have to hold them all to the end, but if you could hold questions till the end of each section so that they can get through the presentation, we'd appreciate that. And again, before I turn it over to the team to walk through the department's budget, I'd like to first of all thank the board for approving me as the director last month. I look forward to working closely with you, your offices, all the other county departments to ensure that collectively we're doing everything in our power to prevent and end homelessness across Multnomah County. I'd especially like to thank Anna Plum and the rest of the executive team within the department for all their work in preparing for this presentation. I feel spoiled that I'm able to just step in on day 2 with so much of the heavy lifting already done for me. So we have an extensive presentation, so I'm just going to end there and turn it over to our Community Budget Advisory Committee.
Great.
Morning.
Good morning. Thank you all so much. My name is Nikki Dardinger. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a member of the Community Budget Advisory Committee for the Homeless Services Department. I'm here with 2 of my fellow CBAC members to read a letter that was thoughtfully and intentionally co-created by our full committee. Before we begin, we do want to take a moment to extend our gratitude to HSD staff who have supported our committee's work over the past year and even before. Bill Boyd, Malka Guffin, Antoinette Payne, Lori Kelly, Emily Nelson, and Anna Plum. Thank y'all. We truly could not do our work without all of you. So for commissioners, again, on behalf of the Community Budget Advisory Committee for the Homeless Services Department, thank you for your thoughtful consideration of our committee's feedback on the department's budget and this year's budget process. We are a 10-person committee. We have diverse members who include people with lived experience with homelessness, people from communities of color, people who work for nonprofit organizations that provide services to people who are unhoused, and people who care deeply about our unhoused neighbors in Multnomah County. Throughout our CBAC's process of reviewing, asking questions, and providing recommendations about the proposed county budget for the Homeless Services Department, we have continually kept 5 philosophies at the center. Number 1, budgets are a tool for justice. Number 2, housing is a human right and everyone deserves to be housed. Number 3, homelessness prevention is essential, not optional. Number 4, people with lived experience and expertise with homelessness and poverty should be active participants in the decision-making process. And number 5, our goals should be focused on ending homelessness and not simply managing homelessness. We often talk of a housing crisis, but that's not really accurate. We have a poverty crisis, we have a homelessness crisis, and we have this homelessness crisis due to the ongoing systemic categorization of homes as a privilege and a tool for building wealth and not a human right. So as we begin to share our reflections and recommendations, our CBAC does want to explicitly reaffirm our support for the Homeless Services Department's stated priorities: keeping people housed, prioritizing housing placements, and maximizing shelter effectiveness. And we understand that by saying yes to these priorities, it does require saying no to other programs and initiatives. While we do agree and affirm our support for HSD's priorities, we also see critical gaps in funding, transparency, and system design, as well as an inability to plan for the long-term sustainability of services for people who are unhoused. As a committee, we do agree that should more funding be made available for HSD programming, we would like to see additional support for placement out of shelter, including rent assistance and housing navigation, more support for culturally specific services, employment programs, and emergency rent assistance to prevent evictions. These funding decisions are directly affecting people's safety and survival. We need to understand that these decisions to cut programs and services that many people rely on will erode trust in our government and our homeless response system. We also need to understand that these decisions will cause harm to our community, with the most impact to our most vulnerable neighbors who are unhoused and living in poverty. Further, it feels important to name that this harm won't impact the housing or the wealth of most of the people making the decisions, including our county commissioners and HSD leadership. As a CBAC, we strongly believe that budget decisions impacting homeless services should be made by people with experience and expertise in homelessness and poverty. As a CBAC, we believe that the people who are directly affected by these budget cuts should be the first to know what is happening and not finding out after decisions have been made. Our CBAC is concerned that the majority of people making these impactful budget decisions may not have lived experience with homelessness and poverty or understand the day-to-day realities of being unhoused. While HSD has created advisory bodies that include people with expertise in these areas, these advisory bodies have zero decision-making power, and further, there is no requirement or obligation for HSD or county commissioners to listen to these advisory bodies or include them in actual decisions. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Darius, to continue our presentation.
And do you just want to hit the...
Oh, thank you. All right, thank you, Nikki. Good morning. My name is Darius Miney-Yao. I use he, him pronouns. I am also a lived experience of being houseless and being hungry as a combat veteran of this country. Budget decisions impact real people. These funds impact real people, our neighbors, our friends, our families, and our colleagues. Damn it. We need to fully reckon with these decisions. People will lose their housing and return to homelessness. More people will be left unsheltered on the street or faced with a choice between spending the night on the street and spending the night in an ineffective overnight shelter run by the city that lacks any path to permanent housing. People will lose their jobs. We know that employment and income acquisition is connected to people's ability to successfully stay housed, but the county is still choosing to cut these highly impactful programs. We see this as being out of alignment with HSD's stated top priority of keeping people housed. When we talk about programs and services, we also have to talk about the people who run them. It is the staff at provider organizations who are building trust and helping people navigate really hard situations. When staff leave, that relationship is gone. And for the people those staff members were helping, it can mean starting all over again. I can speak to that myself. Consistency matters more than people realize. While we don't know how many staff at service providers will be cut, we anticipate that it will number in the hundreds. There's also a cascade effect to these program cuts. Staff burnout and compassion fatigue are real. The decision to close programs will impact parts of the system that are still funded. With less shelters, other shelters will experience more shelter guests. It will take longer for people in shelters to be placed in permanent housing. People will be turned away from shelters and other supportive programs. Next, I'll be addressing the roles and responsibilities. We demand the city and county's roles and responsibilities be clearly defined. Constituents assume best intent of the officials they elect. They trust you to make these decisions that benefit the general public and protect our most vulnerable neighbors, including creating a path to stable, affordable housing for those living in poverty. Role clarity of government entities is critical for developing the effective and efficient homeless service system that people in our county deserve. Our CBAC demands that the county and city work collaboratively to minimize duplicative services and hold each other accountable for ensuring funding is being used for appropriate activities. We recommend the city, the county, and Metro assess outcomes and allocate funding accordingly. For example, the county is responsible for shelters, and HSD shelters are demonstratively more effective than city-run shelters. They produce better outcomes. Funding should be supporting infrastructure that provides services best at keeping our most vulnerable neighbors housed. We ask for transparency in this process and hope that as roles and responsibilities are clarified, that constituents are kept informed. Next, shelter closures. No one should move from a shelter bed to the street. Shelters are not the solution to homelessness. At their most effective, shelters can function at any entry point to permanent housing. We understand the decision to close shelters, although quite frankly, we wish that instead of closing these 24/7 county shelters that are successfully supporting the transition of people into permanent housing, that we may reevaluate these shelters in close comparison to the city shelters. Overnight-only shelters offer no wraparound services. They force people to leave at 6 a.m. with nowhere to go. They don't offer resources. They don't offer navigation support or realistic employment opportunities. They are highly ineffective, and those who stay there loudly agree. The county has said over and over and over again that they have a plan for the transition of shelter guests currently staying in the shelters that are proposed to be closed. However, what CBAC members have heard from shelter providers is that there is no solid plan to support current shelter guests, and there are no dedicated rent assistance resources to support placement into permanent housing. No one should be evicted from a shelter without somewhere safe to go. That should be a baseline expectation. People deserve the respect and dignity of advance notice so they can prepare and make informed choices. I will now turn it over to my fellow colleague, Cameron, to close out our presentation. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning, commissioners. Good morning. My name is Cameron Foster. I use she, her pronouns, and thank you for hearing us out today. Our community deserves to know how their tax dollars are being spent and how well outcomes are being achieved. We respectfully request that beginning in FY27, fiscal year 27, and continuing into future years, the HSD share detailed budget information for each program offer, including access to proposals as submitted to the county. Specifically, the CBAC would like to understand which service providers are applying for and receiving contracts in each program area, what outcomes and services they are proposing and providing, how many people they propose to serve, how funds will be allocated within those organizations, and how prior year outcome data demonstrates those commitments have been met. This level of transparency is a theme here. This level of transparency is essential for fiscal responsibility and for the CBAC to provide timely and appropriate recommendations that genuinely serve our community, rather than simply weighing in without knowing or understanding what is actually, what we are actually recommending after decisions are already made. We want to invest, and we want you all, us as a community, to invest in culturally specific programming. There are claims of culturally specific services that are meaningless if we don't know what communities are being served, what services are being provided to those communities, and what outcomes are being achieved. And it's important to invest in the technical assistance that it takes to leverage and support our culturally specific organizations. These programs are critical, yet often among the least funded. If we are serious about equity, we need both transparency and sustainable investment in culturally specific and responsive services. And we need to consider that reductions within HSD staffing may negatively impact the level of TA, technical assistance, and supportive services that HSD provides to many culturally specific organizations. We've heard from smaller orgs that serve our disproportionately represented and served populations There are times when these important services aren't able to or don't know how to access or procure contracts with MOLCO. And we don't want budget cuts to exacerbate these disparities to access or meeting specific cultural needs. Our community deserves responsible budgets, and our CBAC wants to name that one-year budgeting is inherently destabilizing. A 2- or multi-year budget would promote system-wide stability, and forecasting is ultra important. Our end goal is to cultivate a mutually beneficial relationship of trust and respect between Multnomah County residents and our county government. We can totally do better together. We also want to name that funding for such impactful and life-saving programs being subject to political whims is unacceptable and inappropriate. How can a community grow or heal and transform into a welcoming space for all residents without consistency, trust, and follow-through? As CBEC members, we take our role seriously. We care deeply about our community. We genuinely want to understand HSD budget process, so hard to understand, and the programs and services that are funded. We are asking you to take these budget decisions seriously because the people most impacted by these decisions do not have the option to opt out of the consequences. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all so very much. We really appreciate it.
Yes, we want to make sure you get that.
Thank you. All right, we'll do a little. I'm going to grab it.
Good. Get on up here. I'll be sitting in the back. I don't know. I didn't really want to be right here.
These are, we have two corrected slides. We're just showing a little bit. We're going to be here for a minute. So
150 slides.
157. All right, good morning, everyone. So glad to see all of you here today. Okay, good morning, Chair and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Anna Plum, and I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Deputy Director from Multnomah County Homeless Services Department. I'm happy to be starting out by grounding us in our department's mission, vision, and values. They're included on this slide. I won't read it for you, but I do just want to make sure we're grounded in the fact that everything in our budget is in service to that vision, which is the creation of an equitable community in which all people have safe, affordable, and accessible housing. Next slide, please. As a quick reminder of how we got to where we are in terms of our total budget reduction amount, I just want to remind us where we were on this journey. We came before you in February, and at that point we talked about an $87 million difference between our 2026 revised budget and our 2027 budget. That was correct, but we were able to get that to a $67 million total budget reduction, so I just want to walk us through how we got there. We had $31 million in this year's budget. That's truly one-time only funding. Those are funds that do not need to move into this fiscal year, so you can subtract those, getting you to $56 million. However, services are more expensive every year, so increased services costs amounted to $12 million, which you add back on to the reduction. And then there was $1 million restored in the chair's budget, landing us at that $67 million total budget reduction for this fiscal year.
The $31 million of one-time only.
That is not the city funding.
Okay,
I know it's the same number. And as a reminder, we will be going through a division and then pausing for questions. So we'll have opportunity for questions at the end of every major division. But yes, thank you for that distinction. I know it's the same number and it looks confusing. Next slide, please. Also, as a reminder, when we talked with you in February, we had come up with a problem statement and a solution. We have a major reduction, and so we wanted to make sure we were approaching it very thoughtfully. The problem that we have is that we have a system that we can no longer afford, but that needs to effectively, efficiently, and equitably lead to housing. The solution that we have come upon based upon a lot of work that we'll speak through throughout the presentation, community engagement, best practices, research, is that we need to redesign that system to maximize housing even though we have less funding. Our success benchmarks are efficiency, equity, and effectiveness. By efficiency, we mean folks access housing as quickly as they can, but it also needs to be effective and stable. That needs to be housing they can sustain. And by equity, we mean that we are continuing to focus on reducing disparities in who experiences homelessness, and we do that by supporting and listening to our culturally specific providers. I heard some questions about that earlier, and we'll speak about that work throughout this presentation. Next slide. You will see throughout the presentation in more detail how our budget allowed us to redesign the system as we proposed in our solution. This slide gives you a quick overview of our primary divisions. In green on the left-hand side is the current funding proportions, and in blue on the right-hand side is what we have in our approved budget. As you can see, we right-size the proportions across safety on and off the streets, housing placement and retention, and supportive housing, increasing the proportion of our budget that goes to our housing programs, which are in housing placement and retention and supportive housing. I'm now going to pass it to our equity manager, Emily Nelson, to talk more about the values and priorities that went into this rebalance and how both equity and community engagement really underline this shift.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. For the record, my name is Emily Nelson. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the equity manager of the Homeless Services Department. We can move to the next slide. So this slide depicts our primary priorities in our budget approach, which are related to the success benchmarks that Anna mentioned on a previous slide. In alignment with our department's values that we referred to earlier, specifically equity, integrity, and quality, we continue to lead with race and prioritize reducing racial and other disparities, and we ground our decisions in data and outcomes. We also align our decisions with the priorities in the Homeless Response Action Plan and the Supported Housing Services Local Implementation Plan. And we can move to the next slide, please. So in alignment with our department value of collaboration, the HSD engages our providers on a regular and routine basis in all of our programming. And due to the unprecedented fiscal situation we found ourselves in, we wanted to make sure that to conduct additional budget-focused engagement this year. So the goal was to hear from our providers who are doing the work, their priorities and thoughts around right-sizing our system, as well as get feedback and input on our policy goals so we could make budget decisions that were informed by the expertise of our providers. So as you can see on this timeline, we hosted a session at our fall provider conference in October, and the chair also hosted 2 provider engagements in October. In November, we sent out a survey on our budget priorities to all HSD providers, as well as HSD staff and our CBAC. And then in December, in partnership with the Homeless Response System, we hosted 2 engagement sessions, 1 virtual and 1 in person, to maximize access. The policy goals that I will share on the next slide were arrived at and unanimously confirmed through multiple provider and staff engagements and supported by our CBAC, as Nikki affirmed earlier in their presentation. We did more budget engagement than we ever have, and while people did advocate for different things, there was a universal agreement on these priorities and their order of importance. Provider engagement also supported us in narrowing our focus to these 3 goals. And so we can move to the next slide. So as we walk through the proposed budget, we want to ground you in these policy goals. Our top priority was keeping people housed and ensuring we were not making budgetary decisions that would result in people losing their housing. We also wanted to prioritize housing placements and, relatedly, maximize shelter effectiveness by both supporting safe and accessible shelter for people experiencing homelessness and connecting people in shelter to pathways to permanent housing. I would also like to note that this 3rd priority was at one time proposed as sustaining shelter capacity, and our provider engagement guided us toward aiming to maximize effectiveness in the shelter capacity that we do have. Within all 3 of these policy goals, we are committed to continuing our focus on priority populations and reducing disparities in homeless services. Next slide, please. In facing some difficult budget decisions, we needed to ground ourselves in what services are core to the mission of the Homeless Services Department. We know that all the services here are core to the system of care, but we had to decide what were the core services that are the responsibility of our department specifically, knowing that some of these services support our core services and or are provided by our partner departments and jurisdictions in the homelessness response system. In short, we cannot do everything and also do it well. We also can't afford to do everything. And so the coordination of HRS enables us to trust our partners in delivering the services that they do well. Next slide, please. You've heard me say some of these things before, and I believe they bear repeating. Equity is a core value of Multnomah County and the Homeless Services Department. We also know that communities of color and other marginalized communities experience persistent disparities in the experience of homelessness and in homeless services, and that structural and systemic racism and other forms of oppression cause homelessness for communities who experience them. This means that in order to meaningfully serve the people experiencing homelessness in our county, we have a responsibility to address and work towards eliminating racial and other disparities through equitable service delivery. This means supporting the culturally responsive and culturally specific capacity of our system and applying an equity lens to our work and our decision-making. As our proposed budget is a roadmap for how we enact these values and commitments, it is critical for us to have an extensive equity approach within our overall budget process. So as we have for 4 years now, we used our Racial Equity Lens tool, or RELT, at multiple points in the process. And for the second year, we used our Program Offer Evaluation tool, which we're now calling POET, to assess programming's design and impacts with respect to serving priority populations and addressing disparities. These tools and analyses can then inform the budget decisions made by the exec team and enabling us to prioritize programming that is serving people equitably and impacting disparities. As you've heard me say with respect to the RELT in the past, it was developed by the HSD equity team and designed to specifically address the work of our department. We learned this year it was also easily adaptable to our budget process to maximize the meaningful nature of our equity analysis and make sure that we leveraged our subject matter expertise appropriately. So with respect to program offers and programming, we asked our staff to really focus on the equity-focused intent, design, and impacts of the programming, as well as any engagement or need for further engagement. And then we asked our decision makers to focus on potential impacts of funding decisions and strategies to mitigate or address any impacts given our fiscal realities. As with all of our RELTs, these are also living documents where we can continue to evaluate any adjustments and their potential impacts going forward. And I will pass it back to Anna.
Thank you, Kunal. So in addition to community engagement and our equity values, we are of course also guided by our community and county plans. Over the last year, we have had the opportunity to purposefully align 3 of our major guiding plans, as you see here. In the last year, HSD has actively partnered in the development of a new set of homelessness response action plan KPIs with the homelessness response system. But we have also been active partners in HSD's portion of the Multnomah County Strategic Plan. The timing of those was really impeccable, allowing us to ensure that the 2 plans align and are centered on the same major goals, which you see here, reductions in people experiencing homelessness and unsheltered homelessness, and increases in outflow to permanent housing, and increases in housing retention with a focus on people who have a high acuity of behavioral health needs. We have also ensured that the Workforce Equity Strategic Plan is a part of our goals. We know that Multnomah County has worked hard to ensure that the WESP and the larger strategic plan are themselves aligned, and we really embrace those goals as a department. You will see in our administrative offers and goals that we are focusing on the WESP and strategic plan goals around belonging and employee retention of staff, both overall and within different demographic groups. Next slide, please. We are, of course, also guided by the Supportive Housing Services Local Implementation Plan. This plan was co-developed by the department and community members at the outset of SHS funding, and it represents our priorities of what we intended to do with the SHS funding. This slide shows the SHS LIP goals. Some of them are 10-year goals, and some of them have annual goals associated with them. I do want to note that Metro and the counties are also working together on a new set of KPIs for the cooperative regional SHS work, and we are similarly working with HRS and with Metro and the counties to try to align our new KPIs as much as possible with the ones that Metro is working towards so that we are all rowing in the same direction when it comes to homeless services goals. Next slide. You saw a lot of numbers earlier from the HRS team, so I'm going to do a little bit of context, but I'm going to go quickly through this because we have a lot to go through, and you've seen this. This is just to give you a sense of the estimated number of folks experiencing homelessness over time. This is from our by name list and pulled from our public dashboard. The next slide gives you a sense of what this looks like by race and ethnicity. The next slide, please. And we highlight this every year because we know that racism and homelessness are intertwined, and that people of color are disproportionately likely to be homeless. This graph shows you the 2020 census compared to the folks experiencing homelessness in January 2026, and you can see that multiple groups of color are overrepresented in who experiences homelessness. This graph is one of the reasons, and Emily spoke to this really eloquently, why we focus on reducing disparities as a core aspect of our work. And we will show similar versions of this throughout the presentation as we look at who we're reaching with our services. I do want to make a note about these proportions. What you see here is a snapshot in an annual census. We will see other race ethnicity proportions across the presentation as we look at different bodies, slightly different populations or service groups. So these may not always be exactly the same number. So just to get ahead of that question, that's why that might change. Next slide. This is a similar graph that you saw about inflow and outflow, which you saw in a previous presentation. We do want to note, you can see a few spikes in inflow here, and Ryan Dybert spoke to this, but we do think there is a relationship, we know there's a relationship between service expansion and broader reach, which leads to larger inflow. It's a bit of a paradox. The better our system gets at reaching people and collecting data on them, the more people we track entering the system. So you can see this. We think a lot of this has to do with the expansion of the overnight-only shelter expansion, which is bringing more people into shelter, and they're being served in the system and entered into our database. And we talk a lot about the inflow, but I do also want to talk about outflow and make sure that you see that there is a positive trend in outflow over the last year. This is the positive trend that we want to see. To give you a sense of the scale, in January 2025, our outflow was 865 folks, and by January 2026, it jumped to 1,317. That's a 52% increase in folks flowing out of our system via housing and going to inactivity. That is the trend that we want to see to reduce homelessness, and I want to make sure we highlight that as we talk about inflow as well. I'm now going to pass it to Antoinette for the budget overview.
Sorry, are we going to do questions at the end of that section?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. On slide 8, could you, and this can be follow-up, could you give more specificity to what the increased cost is? What are the categories, and if there's different costs for each? It's just helpful to understand. Is it our staffing? Is it other people's staffing? Is it rent assistance? What is that?
I would say the driving factors is the contract COLA, personnel COLA, and then the increase of a larger budget of PSH for those new units coming online.
Thank you.
Is there a chance to get a graph similar to our race and ethnicity that looks at LGBTQ plus identity as well as disability status?
In the appendix, we have a couple of the demographics. I do not think we have either of those because the data is not as good, but I will follow up and let you know what we can get.
And then on slide 13, under budget policy goals, it says keep people housed, prioritize housing placements, maximize shelter effectiveness. Under keep people housed, is there like a list of the different things that we would fund to do that? I think of workforce, permanent supportive housing, and things like that.
Yes. Well, there's not a list, but I'll speak to your question a little bit. So when we talk about keep people housed, we are specifically focusing on the folks that are housed via our programs. So primarily making sure that our budget does not cause folks who have been housed via our programs to lose that housing. The question of employment is a really tough one because we do, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we do, and I think it's a really good question. We agree and understand that employment is crucial to folks maintaining housing stability. And it is something that is the community needs to support, and with the size of the restrictions that we've had to make, the reductions, it's not something that we can solely support. So when we talk about keeping people housed, we're focusing on retention and stability for the programs wherein we fund folks, and we're primarily defining that as sustaining folks in permanent supportive housing, which is why we did not reduce that division, and trying to protect our housing programs that sustain folks as much as possible.
Thank you for that clarity. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. The 31 million, just that's county one-time only funding that was in the budget.
So I forgot to state my name for the record. Antoinette Payne, she, her pronouns, finance director at the Homeless Services Department. It's essentially money that we have passed to the city. Last year, you all approved $10 million of one-time only general fund, and then there was some state money that we passed over to the city, plus there was some SHS carryover they had from when you all appropriated the unanticipated revenue, and then a little sliver of state funding, and that encompasses your whole 31 million.
So that's, sorry,
It's truly one-time only funding.
one-time only money. But that was embedded in our budget, and we all voted for it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it was a commission decision to do one-time only money. Then another question I have on my numbers are cut off, but the system rebalance, just confirming, there's the $262 million of the FY 20, it's a question for you, for the 2027 approved budget versus the 2026, which was $334 million. Of the $262 million, how much of that is SHS?
I will say, let me go back to my many of appendix slides, which I have. I should know this by heart. It is slide 142. We have $169.1 million for FY27 for SHS. That includes $143 million of ongoing and $26.1 million for one-time only.
So approximately $169 million,
Yes.
which is more, $169 million more than we had in 2019, before SHS. Okay. And then on the slide that has a systems versus department, I'm noticing outside of the inner circle are things like hygiene services and employment services. And I'm not sure I understand the distinction here. So is the department saying those aren't department services? Those ones in the outer circle?
And we will speak more to this as we go throughout the presentation as well. We'll be repeating that visual a few times to kind of remind you how we're thinking about it. There are things in that green circle that we did use to fund at a higher level, including hygiene services and employment services, although employment services has gone up and down over time, and we'll talk about that. What we are saying is, with the size of the reduction that we have to make, we need to focus on our core service areas, which is what you see in the blue. This is not a message that what's in the green is not important, is that it's not the core mission of the Homeless Services Department to solely support those programs. So we're trying to distinguish what are the core services of homeless services, what are other services in the community that are important but that we cannot be the sole supporter of, and the gray is like the larger systems that we need to be functioning to support the community effort.
And then the title of the slide, system versus department, is that implying that these are those are system roles? And who is that?
So you can think about it as the homelessness response system, or you can think about it as the community as a whole. There's a couple different ways to think about it. I will note that, like, for example, there are employment goals in the homelessness response action plan, for example. And the dream of the homelessness response system is that all of the community is coming together to support this, and it's not just the role of the Homeless Services Department to be everything to everyone. And that has really been driven home by this budget, where we cannot afford to be everything to everyone. We need to focus on what we do well, because if we were to fund these things, we would be cutting housing programs that could result in folks losing their housing or fewer housing placements. So we're really trying to focus in on the priority aspects of what we can fund in our budget.
Right. Although a lot of the employment services, people eventually end up being housed and staying housed.
We do have some employment programs that have housing placement.
When they have,
yes.
And the CBAC, I think I heard them calling attention to that as being a very important part of the service. And then there is a slide on the local implementation plan, and at least 75% of the funding to serve extremely low-income individuals and families. This is the population A and B, and maybe it's in a later slide, but can you provide, not necessarily here, but as a follow-up, what percentage of the budget? If we're stating that that's the goal, that we know what amount in the proposed budget is being allocated to that population. And that's it for that section. Thank you.
Can I ask a question about slide 10? I'm looking at the reallocation or system rebalance, and I don't see a significant change. In fact, I don't see a change in the system support, access, and coordination dollar figure. So it's going up in percentage from 7 to 10. Can you explain what that is?
Yes, we have a whole, that is one of the divisions we'll speak through, what is in that division.
Okay.
But it is really all of the things that support the functioning of the system as a whole. It has our HMIS system, it has coordinated access. Kanoi's going to speak to a large extent about what is in there. But it is, there's a lot of the things that hold everything together, essentially. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the budget.
Okay,
Antoinette.
Tasia, sorry, we are now on slide
21.
21, yes.
So I'll do a high-level overview of the department's FY21 approved budget. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the Homeless Services Department FY27 approved operating budget is $239 million, which is 23% or $71.2 million decrease from our FY26 adopted budget. Our total budget is $244.9 million. That includes a cash transfer that we're doing for HMIS and then contingencies. The department in this budget has a $10 million new general fund investment that the chair has put in our budget. Thank you. The department's FY27 budget includes 98 FTE positions, representing a decrease of 17 FTE or 14% decrease from our adopted budget in FY26. If we can go to the next slide, please. In this slide, the FY27 approved budget is compared to the FY26 adopted budget across our three major funds, and here are some key observations that we are seeing. So funding levels for the general fund and supportive housing services remain relatively steady despite slight decreases. The general fund is primarily attributed to a one-time only allocation of $10 million, and I just want to note, of that general fund, $2.4 million of that general fund is video lottery. And then lastly, federal and state fund experienced a significant reduction of about $65 million or 63% compared to previous years. Approximately half of this decrease results from not receiving city general fund, while the balance is due to projected state funding. In the last fiscal year, while the governor's recommended budget proposed substantial investments in homeless services, the final legislative budget differed because of the lower state forecast and this decision to replace funds in contingencies to prepare for potential federal cuts. And we came before you in the fall to rebalance our budget, and that's why you're seeing such a drastic change in our federal and state funding. If we can go to the next slide, please. This slide illustrates the trend of the department's funding from FY19, which is our pre-COVID and pre-SHS, through FY27. It gives you an 8-year span of what our funding has looked like. The department's budget has expanded and contracted over the past 8 years, contracted the past 2 years. The significant increase is primarily due to supportive housing, represented in burgundy on the graph, and you notice that in 2022. In prior years, including the approved FY27, supportive housing services has constituted around half or more of the department's overall budget. This year, our department has significantly less carryover than previous years, and you can start to see that SHS is starting to only have ongoing funding. If we can go to the next slide, please. Similar to the previous slide, this illustrates the trend of department's FTE from FY29 through FY27. It provides a visual context of how our FTE has evolved over time. The graph shows the department's growth or adjustment in relation to our budget. As you can see, the last two graphs, the department has reduced 24 FTE or 20% reduction in FTE in the past 2 years. If we can go to the next slide.
This is just a minor question, but the slide that was handed out, the new one, it's slide 23 on the front and 37 on the back?
Yes. 23, the reason why, there's just a note saying that 2.4 million is video lottery. It's,
So these are the two slides that had changes?
yes, those,
Right. They're just like disconnected from each.
Yeah.
yes.
But they were same trees. Yes. Honestly, the copier did that, and I didn't mean for it to, so, sorry.
The department's budget shows the largest expenditure is from contractual services totaling $194.7 million, or 81.5% of the budget. This reflects the department's operational model of collaborating with our community partners to deliver services on the behalf of the county, a practice consistent with 80% of the budget allocated to contractual services over the past years. Personnel costs represents the second largest expense at $20.4 million, accounting for 8.5% of the budget, and the remainder, 11%, is for material, supplies, and internal services. We saw a 50% reduction in materials and supplies due to shelter closures, due to us not moving forward with the room block agreements with those shelter closures. Next slide, please. I think I will pause to see if anybody has any questions. That doesn't?
I do, let's get into it. On slide 23, I don't care what version, it talks about the change in state and federal. Does that make any projections related to any money the county would get from the feds that could be impacted by their system of care reform? Or is this assuming status quo?
This is assuming status quo. Our understanding is, as of now, we're going to be able to maintain status quo for this next upcoming fiscal year. FY28 is a whole different story.
Okay, thank you.
I'm curious, the FTE slide, a full-time employee trend, that's just county employees. But clearly, we have the entire system is built on hundreds of contract employees. What's the impact on contracted employees or contracted staff by this budget?
We are working on estimating that, which we will provide sort of in coordination with other departments when we have an estimate. We do want to be clear that any estimates would have some pretty major caveats with them, because we work with providers when they are taking reductions for them to help us understand what would make the most sense for them in their reduction in terms of what we're buying from them and the balance they would take between FTE and like client assistance funding or rent assistance funding, for example. But we are working on an estimate to kind of get a sense of the proportion of that impact.
Yeah, and I'm just going to make the point that I've made before, that early on, we were asked to make a very significant investment because the majority of the services are provided by contracted staff, and we were asked to make a really significant investment and rebase contracts to retain shelter staff and other staff. And so if we know that the day-to-day sort of direct services is being provided not necessarily by county staff but by contract staff, it would be really helpful to understand what the impacts are, because again, that will, I think, also tell us actually what we're going to be able to provide, or what sort of capacity we've lost and in what area. So it'd be great to get that with all the caveats that you shared as well.
And I would say on that, I know the work's been happening in response to my question in an earlier budget session around impacts on contractors, so I know it's a countywide piece, and I actually think what will come, I guess I'm assuming some of what will come out of it is that you all are able to estimate in a way that maybe other departments aren't. And Chris Neal, I know we have a conversation coming about this, but I do think there's something to be said for us figuring out how to move towards a contracting practice that will let us know when we're impacting our contractors and staffing of the system across the board. It's not just an HSD question. It comes up for me with DCHS, DCJ, I think probably almost every department. So I think there's, once I kind of work out with the COO what those pieces that are missing, is moving forward a budget note to pull all of those pieces together, so in the future, county commissioners can know what those impacts are.
If we can go to slide 27. So we're going to transition to an overview of our budget at the division level. This section will dive into the budget and key priorities for each division within the department. We will examine strategic investments that underpin our operational plans and service goals for the upcoming fiscal year. This detailed review will provide an understanding of how resources are being used across the department. Next slide. So we have 5 divisions. Safety on and off the streets, housing placement and retention, supportive housing, system support, access and coordination, and admin and operations. Next slide. So these next 2 slides will give you a breakdown of the division. However, further details regarding the core functions of these divisions will be provided by my colleagues and right next to me. If we can go to the next slide. Next slide. This slide demonstrates the budget by division in the upcoming slides. We will dive into each division's budget and FTE in more detail. This slide gives you an overview and general picture of the department structure and how our resources are distributed. So I will pass it to our Deputy Director, Anna Plum, to discuss our division, safety on and off the streets, and housing placement and retentions. And before I do that, any questions? If not, Anna.
Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to spend some time talking about safety on and off the streets. This is the division that houses our shelter, day centers, and outreach programs. Across our budget, the challenge across all of our divisions is, of course, the reduction in resources that we had to address as a department. And our response to that by each division is guided by our priorities that Emily described. Based on these priorities, best practices, and the research that I will describe as we go, we found that it was unfortunately necessary to reduce shelter in order to maintain a balanced homeless services system. And you can see that as the challenge, is that to balance our system, we do have to reduce shelter beds. The response is to help you understand how we are going to do that in a way that supports our top 3 priorities and supports that balanced system. So when we talk about maximizing shelter effectiveness, that means making sure that all of our remaining shelters have access to housing placement resources so folks can exit that shelter to housing. That also aligns with prioritizing housing placements. And when I get to housing placement and retention, we'll talk about how we're doing that via shelter and other pathways. And it also means keeping people housed who we have housed previously. All of this, and our ability to do all of this with the funding that we have, was predicated on having to reduce shelter units, and I'll go into more about that and how we made those decisions as I walk through the next several slides. Next slide, please. To put this another way, an effective homeless services system has to balance shelter, housing, and system support programs. And 24/7 Shelter, which is the shelter that Multnomah County funds and runs in the community, should provide safety and it should lead to housing. Given the funding constraints, our budget reduces shelter in order to protect housing programs and increase shelter's effectiveness in housing people, and to protect the culturally specific and smaller systems that have really great housing outcomes for our smaller communities of care. I do want to make note that I'm going to talk a lot about safety on and off the streets in this division, but all of this budget and all of this balancing is also predicated on the major investment of housing resources that the chair added to our budget. That is $10 million in one-time only funding for housing placement. I will speak more to that in the next division, so you won't hear about it here, but just keep in mind that is part of the backbone of our decisions that we made. Next slide. I want to be clear that shelter remains a cornerstone of our homeless services system and a critical component of our housing continuum. It provides immediate safety and stability that some folks need to transition into permanent housing. While the decision to decommission any site was really difficult, we performed a multifaceted evaluation to help us understand what to close and to make sure our resources were used effectively. When looking at what to close, we looked at the cost per unit. We looked at geographic location of our sheltering across the community, the state of the facilities and whether we lease or own those facilities. If you have something that you own, it might make more sense to spend money to maintain it than a property that you lease. We did look at program outcomes as well, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the nuances there. This specific set of considerations allowed us to balance factors to maintain a system that remains geographically diverse and capable of serving various high-needs populations that might have differing needs for shelter depending on who they are and what they need for their next step. Next slide, please. You're familiar with this. This is division operating budget, and you can see reductions in funding and FTE for our division, some significant reductions here. That's what the numbers look like, and the next slide is kind of the sort of overview of the major reductions by area. The next slide, please, Tasia. This is the one that has a correction. Despite looking at the slide 400 times and knowing this number by heart, we ended up with it saying 675 shelter units, and the real number is 695. So you have a corrected slide there. The very last slide in your appendix is also the chart of each program and the units being reduced. So you have those details in your appendix as well. So these are some of the major reductions we found in this division. It includes reducing 695 units of shelter by the end of August and another 120 mid-year. We've reduced funding to 5 day centers. 4 of those are full reductions and 1 is a partial reduction, and I'll speak more to that when we get to that section, and decreasing 4 FTE in our department. Next slide. This is a map of what our shelter closures would look like across the district. This does include what we understand right now about city shelters. So this is all publicly funded shelters. The dark circles are Multnomah County shelters that will not have any changes. The light gray circles are City of Portland shelters that would not have any changes that we're aware of. Light red circles are planned closures for Multnomah County. Dark red are what we understand right now for the City of Portland. The arrow up on the left is Bybee Lakes, which is doing reduced units, and then the clear circle is a program that has not yet opened and does not have operating funds for next fiscal year, so it would be canceled.
Which one is that?
It is the Workforce Village. Just of note, this does not include our behavioral health shelters or our shelters for survivors, as per usual. We do not include those. Next slide. We know that reducing this amount of shelter is a major shift for our community. It is difficult for our providers and most importantly for the folks who are living in those shelters. For that reason, the chair's budget added some funding to help us support a longer ramp down for folks in the shelters that are closing for some of them. Specifically, there's $1.8 million to keep around 400 of the shelter units open through August 2026. We're not going into the past. This allows us to stagger our closure dates to support system transition. It allows for a longer off-ramp for the bulk of the units to provide better person-level planning. And this is also a direct result of feedback from our impacted shelter providers, who we began talking with as soon as our pending closures were public. Next slide. On that note, I know there's a lot of interest, rightfully so, in how we can fund successful closures and make sure the people who are staying in these shelters have a place to go. Since our recommended budget was announced in February, we've been working with the impacted providers to plan for closures, starting with who are the core team of folks we need to work with and talk about programmatic ramp down, guest navigation, folks who are staying there, and also facilities. We've been engaging our support partners in places like Behavioral Health Division and CHAT to help us understand how can we be on site to actually support folks who are having this stressful transition, but also help find pathways. And then working to support guest navigation so that folks have a place to go. Next slide. When we talk about guest transition, more specifically, we are working with providers to ensure that every person in one of these units will have a place to go that is safe off of the street. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, what that looks like. You can see on the slide there's some primary paths. That could be a housing placement. That could be another shelter unit. It could also be a supportive service, treatment, permanent supportive housing, other options. I do want to talk a little bit about the numbers. As we noted, there are about 200 potentially occupied shelter units that are proposed to close by the end of June. Some programs are still closing at the end of June. 2 of those programs have already started ramp down, and they're approximately at 50% capacity. Of those, there were 70 motel vouchers that were never programmed. So it's really looking to be around 60 to 70 households who will need a place to go by the end of June, not the 200 that you see in the units, because some of those units are not occupied and have already started ramp down. So it's around 60 to 70 families that we are planning for. I do want to note, not families, households. This closure does include about 25 scattered site motel vouchers that families are currently occupying. Our plan is those families will move into the new temporary family shelter that we are opening in District 3, and you got a memo about that from me a couple days ago. Of the 400 units that are proposed to be closed by the end of August, there are some that are also not occupied because they did not fully ramp up. And those, again, have a longer ramp down. And of those that are proposed to close through August, we plan to have the new housing placement dollars, if that is adopted, available right on July 1st, and to really focus that funding on those programs that are closing at the beginning of next year. Next slide, please. So this is what our shelter unit looks like from last year to this year. And as noted, there's a significant reduction in capacity, primarily in the adult system. There's a 29% decrease in shelter units across the system, primarily in the adult system. The adult system percent decrease is 32%. I do want to note within the family system that 90 units represents pulling back on the 90 units of scattered site motel vouchers that we launched last year. About 70 of those were allocated or programmed out to the community, and as I just mentioned, we have about 25 currently in use, and the plan is for those to transition to the new temporary family shelter that we're opening in District 3. Both shelter units for the domestic and sexual violence system of care and the youth system of care are staying the same. Maintaining 100% of our capacity there is a priority, as those populations require highly specific trauma-informed environments, and they're also very small systems, as you can see. Next slide. We have discussed before that one of our challenges with shelter is disproportionate access by race. We've talked about this both with our HRS Steering and Oversight Committee and with you as a board. We have shown in our adult shelter review and in other research that people of color are underserved in shelter across the board. What you can see here is that in fiscal year 2025, 60% of shelter participants identified as white, while 40% were people of color. For reference, the overall population of folks experiencing homelessness is about 50% white. So people of color are underrepresented in shelter. We know this is a challenge, and we have made shifts in response to this already in partnership with the Homelessness Response System and our culturally specific providers. As an example, we had a motel shelter that was culturally specific for Black or African American people, and in partnership with that organization, they requested to move that to a day center with housing resources model because the shelter program was just not working for their folks. We did make that shift, and so we're continuing to have conversations with our providers to make sure that we are shifting our programs to serve the populations that we are hoping to support in reducing homelessness, reducing those disparities. Next slide. One of the items we look at as a key performance indicator is how many folks are served in shelters. Here, the orange is people we anticipate have been or we anticipate to be served in HSD-funded shelters. The blue is system-wide, including all publicly funded shelters, including city programs. You can see that the number of people served in county shelters has steadily increased over the last 3 years, and we are now projecting a decrease due to budget reductions and our strategy pivot to rebalance our system. However, we do also show that because of the simultaneous increase in city programs, including the city overnight shelters, we anticipate serving more people in shelter this year than we have in many years, and next year still serving more people in shelter, excuse me, than we served in fiscal year 2025 or 2024. One moment. I do want to note that our 27 system estimates represent what we know now about the city's plans. So they include reducing the Weidler, Centennial, and Northrop city shelters. That's why this number is slightly lower for the system than when we put in our transmittal letter, because we did not know about those closures at that time. Next slide. Safety on and off the streets also includes our outreach programs. All of our outreach, and we have shifted to focus on this more over the last year as we've constrained resources, is housing oriented. The goal is to meet people where they are. We do offer survival supplies to a certain extent, but the goal is relationship building that then moves to service connection and housing connection. Our outreach is organized in two different ways. We have outreach zones that are organized zones across the whole county, and we are reorganizing those zones as we speak. So the goal there is that you have a zone that is a provider or two is specifically dedicated to that zone, and they can coordinate within and across the zones across the outreach community. We do also have population-specific outreach teams that are not geographically specific. They are asked to go across the whole county, and that includes outreach that is for folks who have severe mental illness and culturally specific outreach for underserved populations. This is not on the slide, but I do want to note that we are working on collecting better data on who is being served with our outreach. Specifically, we have been engaging in technical assistance with our outreach teams to onboard them to new HMIS expectations. We have also started collecting operational data outside of HMIS to help us better understand our ongoing street outreach activities. In the last 2 quarters for which we have data, teams documented over 4,000 locations visited, over 650 new engagements with individuals, and over 3,700 continuing engagement with folks that they had met before. This is not HMIS data, so those are not deduplicated, so there could be repeated contacts in that particular data. We are working to get our HMIS data entry to catch up so that we can have that deduplicated information. We are in a formal event right now to make allocation divisions for street outreach at our reduced funding amount. And notably, HMIS data entry is a heavily weighted proposal question for folks that would like to do that work. Next slide. As I noted, our outreach programs operate with the singular goal of helping folks transition to housing. This represents our goals for how many folks will exit outreach programs to housing. I want to make a little bit of note about these numbers because, again, some of this data that we're collecting is new. The 2026 estimate is a 6-month goal because we started tracking in January. So that 120 represents the 6-month goal for this year. The reason it is not doubled, so you don't see 240 for next year, is that we are simultaneously taking reductions in our outreach funding in this between the 2 years. So we think we will have about 200 people exit from outreach to housing next fiscal year. Next slide, please. Safety on and off the streets also funds day centers. If you'll remember, we increased our funding of day centers as part of the unanticipated revenue in fiscal year 2024. Our current budget continues to fund 7 day centers, but we did reduce 5. 4 of those were full reduction and 1 was a partial reduction. We followed a similar thought process for day centers that we did to our shelter programs, really focusing on, to the extent that the Homeless Services Department, our goal is to connect people to homeless services that lead to housing, protecting those day centers that have a service connection and are not just a public space management function. Focusing on geographic equity, so we have day centers across the county, and also supporting our culturally specific day centers. We do have several day centers that serve specific populations, and we've protected those. The hope here is that we can complement and align with the mayor's plan. We know day centers are a big part of his work as well, and making sure that we are providing a system of day centers that is reasonably aligned with the goals of the 2 systems.
What is the goal of the city system?
I'm not going to speak to the city goals, but I agree.
My question says what plan?
My perspective as the deputy director is that we understand that the city has a public space management need and that day centers play a role in that public space management. Our perspective of day centers is public space management and safety off the streets is really important, and it should also be a safe place for folks who may not have another place that aligns for their needs and should have housing resources associated. That is the end of this division, so I will pause for questions.
Can we get follow-up geography data on day centers? I don't think it's in the same map as
It is
the
not in the
shelters.
same map.
Okay.
Yeah. Mhm. Yes.
Yeah, just on that, like, what are the 5 that are proposed to close?
The 5 that we reduced are Operation Night Watch, Rosehaven, Trash for Peace, and we did reduce funding for the Behavioral Health Resource Center, but the health department is funding it, so that is not going away. And then we partially reduced funding for the Bud Clark Commons. The 7 that remain are the North Portland, Marie Equi Institute, NAFI, Outside In, Africa House, some of Bud Clark Commons, and then Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, which is for folks who have HIV.
Can you send those?
Yes. Yes.
I can't write fast enough.
I was just really impressed that I had the list. And I do.
I am impressed that you have the list. Thank you.
We will follow that.
Put it with all the rest of my paper.
Yeah. And I do think it's important that this conversation with the city is very important. When the mayor's first proposed plan came out, it was the proposal was to have a day center open in each of the 4 districts of the city, based on the council divisions, and that didn't happen. That didn't come to fruition, and so really figuring out how the system is going to be set up if we continue at the same with overnight only shelters, how those day services are going to be built and funded and continue is going to be really important. Yep.
On slide 41, I just want to clarify, because it's separate with PSH, that is a housing placement.
Yes, yes, fair.
And I think the other pieces, transitional housing, behavioral health, those are some of the other positive outcomes that we're measuring for folks. Where do you include if somebody moves with friends or family? Do they go into permanent housing, or is that a separate category?
So we can track it either if it's a permanent or a temporary move with friends or family. So we do track moving in with friends and family permanent or moving in with friends and family temporary, like in HMIS, there are both options.
But when you share that data with us, you've rolled it up into either transitional?
Depending, yeah.
Okay.
For the most part, it's usually communicate to us to be a permanent thing, but yes, we could indicate that as.
Okay, thank you. On slide 45, you made a comment about priority scoring for HMIS data, and which I appreciate. And I will say, as a former outreach provider, my best outreach workers were my worst data entry people. Looking at you, Bill Boyd. A lot of people felt
No
that.
names.
So I'm just curious if we've really explored how to best support folks who are good at that work to do the data entry, and maybe this is a longer conversation, but just that's one of my concerns there is folks being effective, but also I know we need the data.
I think it is a larger conversation. I did just recently review our street outreach manual that we were working on, and it does talk about data entry. I also think it's something we're being really thoughtful about as we build our new HMIS system, and including providers in what does that outreach module look like, how mobile is it, and how burdensome is it to fill out when you're meeting someone for the first time, for example. So excellent call out, and it's a balance between the two.
Yeah.
If I may just chime in there, this is Nathaniel Vergao. So I actually helped BitFocus build out their outreach module, and I can tell you that just from a on-the-ground perspective, it is much easier to do data entry in that module. It also allows outreach staff to be able to track geographically where people are and assign them to encampments, and it really makes the tracking of data more valuable to the outreach worker as well. So it's not just good for the system, it's good for the outreach worker, which incentivizes the data entry for the staff. It makes it more valuable and visible to them, and therefore incentivizes the data entry.
Awesome. And so I think a part of this will be, as you're thinking about the scoring, you'll be pulling in the what it will be as opposed to what it is, because what it is sucks for outreach. Okay. Thank you. How many outreach FTE do we have across the system?
We have 9 providers. Oh, Kanoy Eggleston, Program Director, she, her pronouns. Currently 9 providers, but we can get back to you on how many FTE that encompasses. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then so what I'm trying to get to when we kind of get how many FTE are in there is there's a lot of conversation around day centers or the overnight only shelters. And I'm wanting to understand how are we able to connect our outreach capacity and expertise to some of these other spaces. I know it doesn't look like outreach, it looks like inreach, but it's frankly unconscionable to me that overnight only shelters have no sort of service connection. And when we used to do inreach at winter shelters, there were a lot of the same folks that I served in outreach in that space. And so it just feels like a disconnect that I would love for us to figure out. Again, probably bigger conversation, but it's something I would love to know as in follow-up, kind of what you all are thinking and how some of that connection could happen or what you would like it to look like so we can start working with our colleagues across the river on that. And then I would also add, there's a component of this that feeds into the reentry work that is moving forward at the jail that we heard a little bit about earlier. That also, again, to me, how many of our folks are actually in jail and getting exited, and then their outreach worker has to go find them again? So how are we thinking about these staff that are already particularly mobile and really astute at multiple systems in serving those populations? And I would include that pretrial population. Again, probably some crossover in folks that we saw in the little bit of data that we were able to dig into, a pretty high proportion of folks experiencing homelessness who are also in that system. And I don't mean it to like overburden that outreach workers are only connecting with folks through those referrals, but I think there's a lot of duplication of people in those different systems, and that might be a way to help us close the gap in a time that we can't add 15 more FTE to do the work.
I continue to look at this, and particularly adult side, and see no differentiation between within the adult population, co-occurring issues that may be significantly contributing to somebody's homelessness, and which is in HRAP to some degree, but I don't see it reflected here, particularly behavioral health, although not exclusively, certainly seniors, certainly other types of disability I would call out. But I'm concerned that we are, particularly when we think about long-term success with POP A, I have a concern that we're not integrating behavioral health into our service. I am wildly supportive of a wide open front door. I do not in any way support restricting access to housing support by participation in treatment. But I don't think that we want a system that is not heavily integrated and intimately knowledgeable of how to connect people into behavioral health or disability-related services, particularly if those are significant barriers to successfully being housed. So I throw that out there. I know we are working on stuff, but I'd like, as we vision where we're going, that we need, because it's going to influence everything from, do our outreach workers know how to get somebody in a front door for substance use disorder or voluntary behavioral health care, which I'm going to be honest, is wildly limited. And then within our, case management structure, they need to have those relationships, and then I think about housing placement and having knowledge about recovery as we're helping people find what's going to help them move forward on their personal journey. So that, and I think this is maybe a little bit of like, I come from the disability long-term care side. I don't see a lot of person-centered language, person-centered planning, person-centered navigation, and that might just be a cultural difference. It's a really important component in disability-related services, but I worry about not having enough person-centered approach to this. So that, and if there is a path for matching the service side of SHS through Medicaid, it is a requirement. So, how do we wrap our head around, as we're doing this case management deep dive, what is case management? What is the framework in which you do that work? And how do you center somebody's individual journey?
Commissioner, one thing that you mentioned is around the connection to behavioral health. And I think part of my vision in the workforce amendment is that some of that behavioral health capacity is serving shelters and has some of the apprenticeship time as well as the clinical supervisor's time in our shelters. It doesn't solve the problem, but I will say from experience on the ground, the barrier is actually the behavioral health side, where often a full behavioral health assessment is required for referrals into services. And so I would love to talk with you as we move into the health department on if there's a budget note that makes sense for both of us on opening access to the behavioral health system in a way that doesn't require clinicians to be outreach workers. And then the other piece I just wanted to follow up on was the behavioral health shelters, and something we had talked about in one of the many shelter conversations we've had was opening up referrals to behavioral health shelters to homeless service providers. That was also a closed loop system with behavioral health referring into that. Has that happened yet, or what's the kind of update on that?
Has not happened, is in discussion. Yeah. And then to a couple of the points, we are going to speak a little bit more about health and housing connection in the system service access and coordination division section. So we will speak more to that in that section.
I just wanted to reflect back to one of the earlier slides was the system versus the department. This is the key to that slide is making sure that as we focus on the core elements of the homelessness system, the homeless services department funded programs, those outer rings are things like the behavioral health system and other systems of care. And so as funding is shrinking, the connection points to those other systems become that much more important. So that is one of my primary goals in my first year, is to really build strong relationships with those other departments to ensure that we can be making those referrals across, and that the staff across all the homeless programs understand access to those other systems of care. Because the homelessness system can't serve every need necessarily, but we can make sure that connections to every need can be made.
So I had some questions about this slide, which is where services are provided. What's the current utilization of our 24/7 shelters?
I will have to check the dashboard to give you the most recent numbers, but it is consistently above 90% across the system.
Consistently what?
Above 90%.
Okay. So I'm curious, if we're closing 675 shelter beds, and one of the strategies is to reshelter, the strategy to reshelter, how is that going to happen if we're already almost at full utilization?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. And because we have this sort of time between now, June, and then August, we are already starting to have those discussions. An example I will give you is Chestnut Tree Inn is a motel shelter that is scheduled to close at the end of June. That organization also runs Gresham Women's Shelter, which is a congregate shelter for women. They are planning, as they have spots open up, to have folks move from the motel shelter into the Gresham Women's Shelter. And that's an easy transfer because it's the same organization. We're having those same conversations across the whole community, including the city sites and the city shelters, whereas as we have sites open up, can we help people move to another location?
But if we're currently almost at full utilization, what that will mean is other individuals who would have accessed it won't have access to it because we're resheltering.
So I think another way to say it is that we will not be able to serve the same number of people a night with shelter because we have a reduced number of shelters. That's correct. We will be serving fewer people every night with shelter because of the reduction. The goal of adding that housing placement is that folks are leaving those shelters more quickly to housing, which clears it up for another person to come in. So yes, it is true that fewer people at a night will be in county shelters, and I do think there will be an intake slowing for a while as we do this transition, and the goal is that we move people through as quickly as possible to stability so that we can open up that unit for another person.
So also on this slide, I'm just going to note the disproportionate geographic impacts. One of them that I think I would want to call out. So if the county isn't successful at resheltering or getting housing placement for those individuals, there's going to be a big influx of individuals I'll just speak to District 3, potentially in District 3, hundreds of people that were in 24/7 shelters that, so I'd love to see what the person level plan is, and not just we're counting on the providers to do that, what the person level plan is for all of that, because Southeast Portland is already disproportionately impacted there's other areas in the city, but Southeast Portland by unsheltered individuals, and I'm concerned that this, without planning and really intentional planning, that there will be a larger influx of unsheltered housing in Southeast Portland without support services. And along those lines, I know this is being portrayed as temporary, but the circle that is the canceled, I'm assuming that's the East County Family Shelter that's right on the line?
No, that is the Workforce Village.
What is it?
It's Cultivate Initiatives Workforce Village, a 20 alternative shelter unit.
Okay. then it must, canceled or not, maybe it's not canceled, but it must be further east. I'm pointing.
So we haven't visualized the family shelter because we don't know where it's going to go.
Right. But it's going to be dropped onto here, right next to Chestnut Tree Inn, is my assumption.
It'll be
in East Portland.
So on a temporary basis, we are going to rent about 30 rooms at a motel that is in District 3. We've used that motel every winter for the last several years to shelter families during the winter. So we've been at that location for a very long time. We're using that temporarily while we look for a more permanent location. The goal and the hope is to find that more regular location, long-term, not permanent, long-term location in East County. And by opening the temporary program, we're allowing ourselves to get more families sheltered while we buy ourselves some time to hopefully find a location in East County.
But we're literally closing a shelter that has an adjacent property line, and then we're getting a year lease that can be shortened, literally right next door for a different population, just to.
Yeah, correct. The Chestnut Tree Inn is not as ideal for families in terms of room size, the condition of the motel, et cetera.
But I'm just saying.
Yeah, correct.
We have a shelter provider that was spotlighted as a high performer. I assume that's why they, yeah. I just ask because these would be the types of questions that I will get in the community, like they're just making sense of it, of we're closing one shelter that was a high performing, and then right next door opening another shelter that's actually going to be available to East County residents located in East Portland.
So the family shelter will be available to everyone, and folks will access the shelter via the wait list. It is true that a lot of our families are in East County, but it will be available to everyone. A couple other things. Our providers are working on those person-level plans to make sure that every single person has a place to go that is not outside. We have this is a higher number of shelter units closing at once than we have done in the past, but we do have some track record here. And I do want to note again, like we are part of that ramp up to make sure that we aren't having that impact in the vicinity as shelters close. But I hear you. I can't remember my other.
So along that line, this slide, the funding a successful shelter transition, just. And this is a little bit off of the Community Budget Advisory Committee comments, but just also conversations I had with the shelter providers who are in my district. So it sounds like there's 60 to 70 households needing a place to go in that first sort of tranche. Are there funds in this current budget, I know that it's an impact from the future budget.
Fiscal year, right, yep.
In the current budget to place all of those individuals either in housing or in shelter or motel vouchers. And then I have a second part of the question too.
We don't have any additional funds that we are diverting to that effort. And I think there are some difficulties in that we did have to reduce new housing placement as a part of the state rebalance. So I think what you're hearing from providers is the dual impact of having those placements reduced, and this is a concern. That being said, we are thinking about what would it look like to, what do we have that we can use for housing placement in this year.
So no additional funds, but do you have other funds that you can allocate? I don't want to run into the issue of, we said we were going to do X, but we didn't have any money. So do we have the funds to do that?
I've submitted paperwork for a budget modification to allocate additional funds to exactly that purpose. I don't know where it landed when it's on the agenda. I initially asked for this Thursday, but I'm not sure that it's on this Thursday's agenda.
Well, I guess I'm asking staff because I don't want to get caught in the.
Yeah, so that's what, I mean, we had these conversations when we were putting my budget together, and so the department budget did not have an additional $1.8 million to stagger basically the shelters to help with just these placement issues, nor did it have the $10 million in one-time only for housing placement, which is specifically directed for moving people from shelter into housing. So both of those buckets of money are appropriate for moving the folks into.
Okay, so
I'm sorry, that doesn't track with what we were just told by the department. It says the 1.8 is for keeping open the shelters that won't close until August. That doesn't impact the shelters that are closing in June. And now you're saying the 1.8 and the 10 million is exactly to mitigate that impact, but that's all FY27. So we're talking about the shelters closing in June. don't have dollars to house folks or to put them in hotel vouchers.
So So one of the 1.8 was to stagger, right? To stagger when the shelters were be closing, to give some more time for placing people to December.
Right, and the deputy
talking
director
about
just said that those dollars are for the shelters that are staying open through August.
That's right. So we had a conversation as we were putting my budget together about what the needs were for being able to successfully transition the shelters that are planned to close in June. And there was not a request for any additional dollars to make sure that those transitions could happen successfully.
By the department, but there has been by providers, and that's why I've moved forward a budget modification.
Yeah, and which I would support. So I guess I'm not wanting to get trapped in another situation where it's like, this is what's going to happen, but then there wasn't the dollars to follow it. So I really want to know, it's like, I wasn't sure from your answer whether those 60 to 70 households that there are placement dollars in this year's budget. So again, I agree with Commissioner Singleton. We need, if you don't have it, we need to allocate it, because I don't think we can represent like, hey, there's going to be a plan, but we didn't fund it because, I mean, that's what people are saying about the community sheltering strategies. But like, if
yeah. So to clarify the numbers a little bit, there are about 25 folks in the remaining Chestnut Tree Inn, which is our housing-focused motel shelter closing June 30th. The VMO, the Voluntary Isolation Motel, that is a program that has shorter, that is for medical isolation, and sometimes folks are staying there when they need to isolate from a different program, so it's a slightly different context. There's about 25 in that, so that's about 50 folks. The remaining are families and BHD, and we're working with BHD to figure out what the needs of those folks and their scattered site motel option is, and then the families who will be going to the other temporary shelter.
Okay.
So it's a smaller number, and to answer your question, we did not have any extra housing placement dollars that we were able to give to programs that are closing in this fiscal year. So I understand the concern, and we have heard specifically from those providers that they are concerned about having funding to find places for folks. We are problem solving that with them, but there is, I do think the resource is a concern.
So an amendment proposed by Commissioner Singleton, that would be helpful, or you're problem solving in some other way?
Well, I do want to note that.
Or maybe you can come back to us, because now you know what my concern is.
Heard. Yeah.
And then I'm going to tell you this, my second concern and my second question is, so in theory, if you have till June 30th, and you still, even though half the people are gone, you still need staff there. And in order, if you're a staff person who's in a shelter that is going to be closed, you're probably looking for a new position, potentially. And so the question is, like, are we providing retention dollars so that those providers can retain their staff until they effectively have moved everyone out? So both retention, but also like potentially severance, because most people, if you know you've got a cutoff date, the logical thing to do is to start looking for another job, but that will mean that there aren't the staff to ramp down. And what I've heard from providers is that, that's something they're going to need assistance with, and I think we should anticipate the next tranche, if closures are made, that same resource will be made, because it's not just everybody stays until the last days and then they leave. It's not naturally what happens.
We are working to figure out what's allowable in that realm around like retention or severance. They're not our staff, right? And so we're trying to figure out what is allowable in the contracting relationship. So we're working through that. We have heard that request. I do want to note one more thing for the scattered site family vouchers. I had said they're going to go into the new family system. That's true. We also have state ORI funds that we are redirecting to those families to get some of them in housing as well. So on the family side, it really is the smaller adult shelters that we need to focus on. And what I was going to say was, as we think about funding new placements in this fiscal year, these are folks who will need funding into next year to stay. So making sure we're thinking about not just the new placement, but how long they might need to be sustained next year and how that impacts the overall picture. So that's just something we think about every time.
So I appreciate the discussion, and when you've had more time to think about it, maybe to talk again. I'm right now focused on those two, given one of them's in District District 3, but know that also, I mean, because several more in District 3 are closing or scheduled to close 2 months later, like, how is that planning going to impact it, and how is it going to be funded? Thanks. And this is just a, not right now request, but when you have this slide that compares, it's by percentages, and it would be helpful just to get the absolute numbers, just to have some context. This slide, so I'm assuming that it's on Safely Off the Streets, people served and sheltered, and it shows the counties. I'm assuming that orange is the county?
Yes.
Okay. Declining, but, you know, the gap between what the county provided and the overall number of people served is still, I mean, if you add on that additional income, it's still at a fairly high number.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, can you provide specifically what is the gap between the 13,074 and the 6,782? It's like, I'm assuming that part of that is, a big chunk of that is the city and then other providers. So if you could provide that, just to give the context, because as we think of as a system, like if other parts of the system are going to make dramatic reductions, then like this looks like a gentle glide, but based on what other system partners do, it could be a big cliff. Mm-hmm. So I'd appreciate that. And on this housing-oriented, that you have a statement like survival supplies, is that a reinstitution of handing out tents, or is that, no? Okay. And that is, that's it from that section. Thank you.
Okay. Tasha, can we please go to, thank you. I was like, I don't know what slide I'm on. Slide 49. The next division is housing placement and retention. This encompasses our shorter-term housing programs, usually called rapid rehousing. As a reminder, rapid rehousing is a short-term rental subsidy with housing placement and retention case management. Folks can receive up to 24 months of rapid rehousing, but it's usually much shorter, and we fund rapid rehousing across all 4 systems of care. So outside of the challenge inherent in our reductions, I actually just spoke to this a little bit. Within housing placement and retention, we know that we have to balance new placements with ensuring the folks that we've housed previously are stable in that housing before they end their subsidy. With our first priority to keeping people housed, we have to balance that out as we plan for our investments. To do this, our budget does a number of things, and I'll talk a little bit about this as we move forward. In building what we thought we could place in terms of new placements next year, we did estimate how many folks we'd need to sustain, and I'll talk more about that. We prioritize different ways to house folks, and I will also talk more about that. And of course, this budget includes a $10 million one-time only investment to help us place folks specifically out of adult shelter into housing as we rebalance our shelter and housing resources.
What does that mean, and how is that different from how we have been operating rapid rehousing?
The one-time only piece?
Yes. Is it a 12-month?
So the specific rental assistance per person will be determined by that person's need within that 24 months. It is all rapid rehousing. So that is $10 million, all of rapid rehousing. This is not a permanent supportive housing investment.
Yeah. Is there a distinction in how an individual would experience?
Rapid rehousing, one of the reasons we really protect and preserve rapid rehousing, it is intended to be a flexible resource that can be used depending on what that person needs. They might need a month of deposit and some back rent paid. They might need 6 months of rent assistance with case management. It really is meant to be flexible to help that person, and I'll go through a pathway about how that looked for a family. So it is a very flexible resource in that way. Next slide. We've talked a lot about our priorities and how those are built from community engagement and our equity goals, but they're also really built upon data and research, and I wanted to highlight that here. Here you can see thumbnails of 2 recent reports that, alongside with community feedback, really informed our budget decisions. The first is our adult shelter review that was performed in-house at HSD by our research team and in partnership with lots of other folks. That was a review of all adult 24/7 housing-focused shelter, looking at things like length of stay, cost per unit, who is being served, and performance on housing outcomes. That review found 2 things. First, the biggest predictor of housing placement out of shelter was access to housing resources. And second, that housing resource access was not equitably distributed across our shelter system, leading to a variance in outcomes. And so that has really impacted how we're designing our budget and what we plan to do moving forward, and I'll speak to that. The second is HSD funded the Portland State University Homelessness Research and Action Collaborative. They are working through 2 phases of what they are calling the Pathways Report. This is a report based upon intensive surveys of folks who have lived experience of homelessness, some of whom are now housed, to help them understand their challenges to accessing housing and what helped them access housing. 2 things, many things have emerged from that report, but 2 that influenced our budget are that deeply affordable housing was the greatest need and that financial barriers were the greatest challenge. So this has really highlights our need to focus on housing assistance in our budget. Next slide, please. So how are we doing that? While we are reducing shelter, as we just discussed, this budget adds $10 million in additional placement out of shelter funding. We are focusing on the adult shelter system in this fiscal year. That will fund 770 additional placements out of shelter for a total of 1,300 new placements out of shelter next fiscal year. Well, we will look at the housing rate over time exit rate in a couple of slides, but our analyses show that if we were to do that, that would mean that 30% of folks exiting shelter are exiting shelter to housing, which is an increase from previous years. But it's not just adding funding. Like I said, the adult shelter review found that access to housing placement wasn't equitable across our shelters. And as we add that funding, we are continuing a redesign of an existing model that we have for mobile sort of in-reach placement out of shelter. The goal here is that shelter-based housing placement resources will be more mobile model, meaning that the size of a shelter or the ability of a provider who is a shelter provider does not necessarily impact housing placement. And you mentioned this, Commissioner Brim Edwards, and we do want to acknowledge that our shelter closure decisions included closing shelters that had housing success. And the intent here is to be able to replicate that success more equitably across the remaining shelters so that we don't have winners and losers in terms of access to housing placement and housing outcomes. Next slide, please. This is the funding by division and FTE. I do want to highlight that for us, we're very proud that we were able to get close to our housing placement and reduction budget of the previous year. We did take reductions, but really did try, as we focus on housing, to protect our housing placement and retention budget as much as we can. Next slide. That doesn't mean we didn't take reductions, and I'll talk more about these, but I do also just want to be explicit. This division did previously include our eviction prevention and our employment programs, and we took reductions in both areas as a way to protect housing placement. That includes reductions for 436 households getting eviction prevention through a few different small programs. I do want to highlight the chair's budget includes additions in eviction prevention in our sister department, Department of County Human Services. And we did reduce employment services, and I'll talk more about that in a few slides. Part of this included reductions to programs that lost city funding while sustaining some city-funded program, specifically culturally specific programming, and protecting our rapid rehousing for our family, youth, and DSV programs by rebalancing placements in the adult system. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a look at our new placements and folks being sustained across time with a highlight of what we're doing this year for our new placements. That big orange column shows the planned new placements for this fiscal year. 1,200 of those, almost 1,300, are the one-time only investment to help people get housed out of shelter. And then the remaining 1,400 are rapid rehousing placements across all 4 systems of care through other pathways, and I'll talk more about what that looks like in an upcoming slide. This would be a 36% increase of our placement numbers from 2020 that we're projecting for this last year, the current year that we're in. As a reminder, this year is lower because of the state rebalance where we had to reduce housing placement mid-year. So we are proud to see that we are hoping to get close back to our 2025 numbers in housing placement as we rebalance and refocus on housing in our system. Next slide, please. This slide just blows up the earlier slide to show what we're talking about in terms of total number of folks placed and sustained in rapid rehousing programs across the last 3 fiscal years. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this because the sustained is sort of new to us, and it is a somewhat new way to talk about our work that some of us like more than others. This is the second year we've been able to visualize folks who are sustained in our programs for rapid rehousing. Place, the orange, that's new placements. That are folks those are folks who are currently homeless that will be newly placed into housing next fiscal year, or who were homeless and were placed newly in that year. Sustained is a little bit different. Those are folks who were previously placed in a rapid rehousing program and are being sustained for a number of time across that fiscal year. We talk about this for 2 reasons. Number 1 is that if we just focus on new placements, it skews what the cost of a new place. If you look at our total funding and just new placements, you're missing those folks we are sustaining, and it skews the cost. And it also hides the fact that we are sustaining a lot of people in their housing on any given day. We want to make sure we're highlighting that's what we're doing. The other reason we highlight it, and I talked about this previously, is the number of folks that we think we might need to sustain impacts how many new placements we can afford. In 2027, these are estimates based upon our data on average length of stay, by program, et cetera. We will work with our providers, and we have in the past, to go back to them and say, okay, how many folks do you actually think are going to need sustaining into next year, and for how many months? And then we can adjust accordingly once we have that information from our providers. Neither of this is the same as retention, and I'll talk about retention in a little bit. I know you have questions on that. Next slide. Our last few slides focused on adult placement out of shelter, but we do want to highlight that this division also supports housing pathways and populations outside of adult shelter. There is a significant amount of funding in this division that is not linked to adult shelter placement. A large portion of that is for our smaller systems. That top row is housing placement and retention for family, youth, and survivors of domestic and sexual violence. These systems have strong housing outcomes, and they serve high proportions of BIPOC and other marginalized groups, and they have tiny shelter systems, meaning that housing funding is even more important. This division also does fund some of the supportive services that lead folks to that rapid rehousing program, and our pathways will highlight that in just a moment. We do also have other adult placement dollars that is either culturally specific or non-shelter linked. This division also includes some HUD COC programs, and we do fund match for our nonprofits that get HUD COC rapid rehousing. We fund that match for them to help them afford to do their work. And there's a small amount of state emergency order programs that are rapid rehousing by definition. Next slide. Another reason I wanted to highlight these non-shelter pathways is that there are equity implications to protect housing programs that aren't strictly shelter-based. We saw in a previous slide that our folks of color under-access shelter based upon their proportion of the population. And so you might expect that when you're doing housing out of shelter, you could have disproportionate impact on who is accessing those housing programs. So we did take a look. This is fiscal year 2025, and it does not include our survivor data, at who is enrolled in housing programs and placed in shelter programs and non-shelter-based programs. Those top 2 rows were shelter-based programs, and you can see of the percent of folks who were enrolled in rapid rehousings, between 53 and 59% of those folks were BIPOC, and around 60% of all placements went to BIPOC folks. That's actually better than you might expect based upon the service data that we saw of who's accessing shelter. But when you go to non-shelter-based programs, those numbers go to 70 and 73. So we are doing a better job at serving people at above their proportion of the population, which is what you need to do to reduce disparities in our non-shelter-based housing programs, which is one of the reasons we really want to make sure that we are protecting those other pathways to housing in our budget. Next slide. So this is a sample of what I mean when I talk about rapid rehousing, non-shelter pathway, and those supportive services that support that placement. So Tristan and his child called 211 to access homeless services, and they were connected to the El Programa Hispanic mobile housing team. That organization provided 12 months of rental assistance and wraparound support to the family. That support looked like collaborating with public defenders to expunge convictions and using barrier removal funds to clear debt so that they could move into their housing. It also included furniture, bedding, and food boxes. That family is stably housed and supported, and which all of these supports together turned that housing crisis into a fresh start. So this is, we spoke about this, but just to reiterate that we have seen this before, but this is the same slide you saw before, comparing who is homeless compared to who is who is in our housing placement and retention program. So you can see that several of our groups of color, Black, African American, Hispanic folks, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander are accessing these programs above their proportions of the population, which is what we need to see to reduce disparities. So this is exactly what we want to see. And it's one of the reasons, again, that we highlight our housing programs, as they do serve our priority populations. Next slide. This is the KPI around new placements. You've seen this, but looking at our new placements, again, we are proud to have gotten almost to the level of fiscal year 2024 in the new placements of folks into housing after having to reduce over the last several years. Next slide. This shows the impact of the additional funding on placement out of shelter. This is looking at people who exited shelter, how many exited that shelter to housing. And we think with this new investment, we can get to a 30% rate of people exiting from shelter to housing. This is across county-funded shelters. As the shelter units, if shelter unit numbers change across the budget, this rate will change, and we can keep you all up to date on what that would look like. But right now, we think we are increasing to a 30% exit from shelter to housing rate. Next slide. Another outcome and KPI that we track is the outcome is maintaining folks in housing, and the KPI is retention. For rapid rehousing, we look at retention post-subsidy. So once that person is no longer receiving a rental subsidy, are they maintaining that housing? And we look at it at 6, 12, and 24 months. This shows our retention at 12 months over time across all of our program offers. Our target is 80%. We have made it so that our contract targets match our program offer targets, which match our budget targets. So that is why our target is 80%, but we consistently outperform that target and are in the 83 and 84 in the last 2 years in terms of retention at 12 months. Finally, I do want to talk more about employment. Next slide. I am re-showing the visual that we've talked about a few times today to show that we have employment in the green circle. We agree that employment is crucial to the community's efforts to reduce homelessness, but within our funding constraints, it is not something we can support alone without making reductions in housing programs that would destabilize the balance of the system. We know this is a difficult decision, and we want to talk a little bit more about our thinking and the history of employment funding. So next slide, please. This slide shows the recent history of employment program funding in the HSD budget. It's not on the slide, but prior to the SHS measure, employment programs were funded at less than $1 million in the HSD budget. This went up significantly with SHS, and as you can see, we had almost $6 million of employment programs in the fiscal year 2025 budget. Last year, as we were facing reductions, HSD actually recommended reductions to employment programs last year as well for the same reasons we have done so this year. With the size of a constraint, we simply cannot keep employment without reducing housing programs, or we have not yet found a way. And as you can see, the chair and the board both bought back programs. That 2026 approved is the chair's approved budget, where she brought back some employment programs, and the board made amendments to buy back additional programs, all with one-time only funding. So in this fiscal year, we again requested to reduce those, and some was added back in the chair's approved budget. The next slide shows what is in the budget now at a high level. Next slide, please. So what is in the approved budget right now are our low barrier employment programs that are really focused on that first step to employment, and are culturally specific, and some of our youth employment programs. And I know I've said this, but it does bear repeating. It is not that employment is not important, it's that we as HSD with our constraints cannot be the sole supporter of employment programs in our community. We hope that we can use this as a transition year with our partners in HRS, because we do have goals in the HRAP around employment programs to strengthen support for employment programs across the community. That is the end of that division, so we can now take questions.
Can we talk about the 17% that are unable to maintain housing, and also the 9% on permit supported housing who do not transition into the next year? What do we know about those individuals? Have we looked at outcomes and seen if there are patterns?
I don't have a data analysis for you on it with some caveats. I will say, looking at the health share data, that we were able to work with health share to combine data on who was in our programs, we did find that the high acuity behavioral health cohort, these are folks who have who from their health care data, we can see they have high acuity. We have proportions of folks, high proportions in PSH and some in rapid rehousing as well. So from our discussions with our providers, with our landlords who are supporting these folks, we do have a lot of folks who have a really high need for services that we may not be fully filling even in our permanent supportive housing units, that is impacting the livability of the programs and also folks' ability to maintain their housing. So that is a major challenge that we need the community to help us solve as we work towards behavioral health and other recovery resources as well.
Okay, looking at slide 63, where you've kind of got your circle and bigger circle and then exterior. One of the issues that I have with this framing is to have medical care and behavioral health outside of those things is to not understand that Medicaid will not fund the housing portion of anything. And so I just fundamentally disagree that those are exterior to your core mission or peripheral. I don't think you're the sole entity to solve that. But I like when you talk about your 4 populations and the fact that behavioral health is not the 5th, to me makes no sense. Because we know in the data, it's 50% of our shelter population. We know that it disproportionately are people who we're making placements that it's not successful for, that our providers tell us the biggest issues that they are having is people above the acuity. So they are in our homeless system. We don't have a plan around it, but they're there every day. And to some degree, they always will be, because a lot of people will not meet, I'm not using this this is a Medicaid term, not where I believe people need to be, which is institutional level of care. In order to access true residential services, even if we open up the K, which I can't wait, and I really do think it's going to help with some of the people who in permanent supported housing it might not be enough even at a full fidelity. We will have people whose behavioral health issues are contributing to their lack of success within us trying to move them through the homeless services system. So some of the things that, I think about, and you're aware that I have a proposal related to opening up recovery housing as a housing option within rapid rehousing. Thinking about, how do we do case management that includes care coordination on the behavioral health side for our individuals who are experiencing severe persistent mental illness. So I'm nervous that if we want to improve our placement outcomes, or we want to talk about the 70% of people who are not moving out of shelter into housing placement, we have got to tackle behavioral health not as tangential. Now, I don't think it's homeless services' job to be mental health professionals or to be the provider of the health portion of that. I do think we got to talk about what Medicaid can do in supporting housing services. I think I am very, very interested in the 1915I because it is a much lower eligibility threshold, and I think a very significant number of our adults experiencing homelessness, absolutely, Pop A, are going to qualify under the I. The I, if designed correctly, and it is up for redesign, will cover some employment services. It's not going to cover the wage, but it does cover and can cover job coaching and some of those other supports around somebody in that. It can cover move-in costs. It can cover furniture, it can cover the support services, it covers case management. So I challenge how we're thinking about this, because if we view behavioral health as out here, one, there is today absolutely no integration at all, but also it has to be abraded because the housing still is yours. So that's my one, like I saw this and I just felt like we aren't there yet in our thinking about this. And we have to think about what we're doing and how you could translate it for those who will be eligible for I into a matchable expense. Because I really hope Jeff is wrong, although he tends to be very accurate. Next year is not looking great for us. So I want to put that still on the table. And I do think that we have to be more aggressive about the Medicaid in the homeless system and outside.
Just two quick things. We are working on a pilot for I, and we're focusing on PSH. And my team is chatting me that we are doing the next high acuity behavioral health analysis with HealthShare is on folks in PSH, so they can figure out where to focus programming. So we are doing some of those pieces. I realize you had a much larger point that is very important and well received, but just wanted to flag those two things.
I honestly think it's just a challenge of the visual. I think you needed to go more of a Venn diagram than what you ended up with, because that overlap piece is really critical. Because I would add some of the pieces around employment. It's not just for me what you all are doing in employment services and low barrier, but it's the folks that we've placed in rapid rehousing who need ongoing rent assistance that we don't have, or they're not having the ability to increase their income while they're getting rent assistance. This has been the whole point of my workforce tables, is we are putting people in housing and we're ending their homelessness, but we are not ending their poverty. And so we are investing $44 million across the enterprise in employment services, but very little of it is connected to y'all's households. And that's the missing link for me, is how do we connect people to the opportunity to actually increase income for those who can, while continuing to solve for those who will be on that fixed income, whether it's Social Security or disability income. But I want to also appreciate you for implementing the InReach program that I have been hounding you all about for a year and a half. I'm really excited about it. I will look forward to outcomes of it as you all implement and pull those pieces together. So I'm assuming some of this will come back in some briefings when we get on the other side of the budget. I would be interested in follow-up to understand total goals across your contracts. So what are the DV placement goals, youth placement goals, family, and then adults? I don't know that we set targets for placement into transitional housing, but I worry that I don't see a lot of conversation about placement out of transitional housing, and that's not just here, it's in every homeless service conversation, whether it's with the city as well. So that's another piece I'm trying to understand, is how are we monitoring outcomes of transitional recovery housing and then folks getting into permanent housing from there. Sorry, I didn't say a slide number there, but I think you know where I was going. I'm not going to belabor the sustained household things right now. I think you guys are so sick of me talking about it, but it still doesn't quite land for me, so I want to keep talking about it until we understand, because there's some disaggregating, again, I think to Commissioner Moyer's point earlier, of how many folks need income acquisition, how many folks need permanent rent subsidy, how many folks, I used to place people in rapid rehousing because they were on a wait list for a rent regulated unit.
Yep.
So understanding some of those slices in there would be helpful. I know it's hard in the current system, but over time getting to that would help us know how we can target investments a little more explicitly. I think the other piece I'll just say in this section is I know that there's this piece around employment programs, and I definitely get where you all are going, but I want to be clear that you're not the only ones paying into employment services. It's more about what I said earlier is how are we connecting the household served by providers to the other investments the county makes in employment services? And that's a big missing link for me. I will likely do a follow-up budget note from my one asking for the report this past year about workforce investments, but the more explicit ability to de-silo within the county and get your folks into these services would be really helpful. Some of the work you mentioned earlier, Commissioner, about some of the services that are reimbursable. We have some of that in a workforce program, but it's in a different department that y'all don't know anything about, and it's not connected to what you're doing. And so that's some of what I'd like to see us take a next step on. Now we know the lay of the land. How do we now implement it so it's more functional for the human beings being served? So I will, of course, work with you all, as well as our friends at the Health Department and DCHS on putting together that budget note to make workforce more explicitly connected.
So I just want to do a time check. We have about 4 minutes left. We have 30 slides. So what I am going to suggest is that we invite HSD to come back tomorrow afternoon when we have time for callbacks for folks to, I know, I mean, you all are here and we have all the questions in the world for you.
Can I finish asking my questions about this section?
Yeah, I just want to set the stage so like everybody understands what to expect. So we'll invite you all back tomorrow after our afternoon budget sessions when we have some time for the follow-up, so that so we can finish on this and then pick up where we left off.
All right. The slide on how the budget delivers, there is the statement, deeply affordable housing is the greatest need. What is the overall amount of deeply affordable units that we need? And what do we currently have? And this is not necessarily focused on you, but it's going to be focused on the city. So.
I don't have those numbers memorized, but I know that PHB produces reports on a regular basis, so I can talk to them and we can get you that information.
So yeah, I just want to make sure we know exactly what, we're aiming at. And so, because it may be, even if we had the money, there's not the unit. So that would be the first question, so it'd be great to get that.
And Jillian said 20,000 units are needed of 0 to 30% affordable housing in her presentation over the next 20 years, I believe it is.
Yeah, I'll send you the
Okay.
PowerPoint from
Yeah.
the last SOC meeting.
Actually, just the thing I want is, we have a statement here that it's the greatest need, what is the size of the need and what currently exists? Again, trying to identify that gap. On how the budget delivers, this is built on spreading so we had the shelter report, and I think I mentioned at the time, there was this matrix with each of the shelters about what type of services they had, but it was without, I think, any sort of qualitative or quantitative information, they provide some sort of health service, but it was a check, and it could be I think I asked at the time, is that once a month or several times a week? So I'd be curious, just again, this is a from-to exercise, if we're going to make it more equitable, what is the sort of qualitative and quantitative, currently the services or the placement out of shelter dollars, and then where are we moving to?
Yeah,
Like I said, I felt like the shelter report, because it was a little bit mysterious for me when we had the shelter report, we heard from the Chestnut Tree, and actually they were being closed not because they weren't providing the outcomes or didn't provide services, but because their lease was expensive or was up. So I just think it would be good for us to have this information if we're going to be saying that we're going to be more equitable. What does that mean?
So we are in the process of that reallocation that includes a formal allocation process, via contracts and procurement. So we do not have the answer right now as to what that will look like yet. And I will say it will be somewhat TBD until we know what the final sort of system will look like. But yes, we will come back for that information when we have it, but we do not have it now.
Okay. The FTE slide on housing placement and retention, you look at this, if you were just a resident of Multnomah County, you're like, oh, we're going to go from 13.5 to 14 FTE. but we're going to make a whole bunch of progress. So I think it's because there's a lot of contract workers. So again, my same question, I think this doesn't tell me a lot. Like with half FTE, we're going to do all this work. We're actually going to do it with this much larger network. So it'd be great to see sort of something similar, like a bar with that had the contract. This is for later, but providing definitions on these new slides of definitions of sustained and retention. It may be a nuance that is not going to be picked up by everybody. On this slide, other housing pathways and populations. I didn't follow this. These are all percentages, and then there's a dollar amount in the bottom. Is that because they are percentages of the 42 million? Which means that almost half of it goes to DSV, family and youth. Is that, okay.
Yes, that is accurate.
This slide right here, the placement rate, is that another term for flow through? Or that's the outcome of the flow through? Or are we not using flow through anymore?
So that is for a housing program within an entity. So for example, I was enrollment in a housing program and then placement out of that housing program into housing. So it's that you couldn't look at that and say of shelters, this is the shelter exit rate. Flow through is really more about for shelter specifically, of how many folks are accessing that shelter, how many are exiting to housing. That could be applied if you're looking at a shelter program specifically, but across the board, it's looking at how many folks were enrolled in a housing program. Of those enrolled, how many were placed into housing. Yeah.
Okay. So I haven't seen yet a flow-through prediction. Are you still using that as a metric of just, again, the formula? We have X amount of shelter, or we have X number of people on the street?
So
specifically for the shelter?
Slide 61 has the exits from shelter to housing, the exit rate, which we are anticipating increasing from a projected 19% of folks who exit shelter, exit to housing, to 30% this next fiscal year with the additional housing resources.
So that's your flow through?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I'm just going to speak again to the employment programs. And I'm probably going to keep talking about this because I look at the impact of the closing of the shelters disproportionately in East Portland, along with the defunding of most of the employment programs, is going to be devastating to East Portland. It's a very, there'll be huge cuts to Cultivate initiatives, which provides most of those employment programs. And if you combine the two together, I think it's really going to be tearing a safety net in East Portland, that there will be no place for people to go, and I don't see a really specific targeted strategy. Also, from just a philosophical standpoint, and this would be I very much see it should be inside that inner circle, because employment programs, they're a way for people to be self-empowered and to for self-sufficiency and to actually gain some agency to get housing. And so I don't view it as just this other thing, because if they're not self-sufficient, we're going to be helping them with rent or more rent assistance that we might actually have to, or be sheltering them. So I would like us to be thinking about it a different way, is that we're actually giving people the tools to help themselves long-term. And you can go out to Cultivate initiatives and just hear story after story about how people, when they had the lowest barrier, low barrier employment, just to get that like first job after being chronically employed. That's the ticket for them to have long-term stability and be able to actually also pay for the things they need and housing. So I'm really going to resist saying that that's something else, because I think it's a critical part of the role. Thanks.
Yeah, and just in closing, as you know already, as far as employment services and same with hygiene services, I hear from Cultivate all the time. I'm biased because I served on their board. The power of a shower, the very first, Jen is one of their workers, and I met her 4 years ago at Bella Vista Park when she was unhoused and she was living at 1,000 acres, and I encouraged her to go to Cultivate. She did. She's been there for 2 years now. So again, and then I think about just H1, whatever the federal government's new stuff is going into next year, as far as the need to work or the requirement for work, and just being prepared for that. I think that's extremely key and crucial as it pertains to work and then hygiene services. The only question that I have based off of the presentation so far is just we were looking through the program offers and specifically around outreach and Gresham's homeless services. They cover the whole gambit from eviction prevention, outreach to rapid rehousing. Where does that program live within the program offers? Because that we're prepared to present an amendment today just to ensure that we remain current, the funding remains current for outreach for them, and then also for the 3 smaller cities. We were unable to identify where the funds are as far as outreach and homeless services for the 3 smaller cities as well.
Yeah, so you are correct that there have been specific program offers in the past. Gresham and East County cities receive their funding via outreach and in-reach programming, all of which is being redesigned as we reallocate across zones and new amounts. So we couldn't put in a program offer that just said TBD. So funding, we are committed to providing outreach funding to Gresham and the East County cities. We are working through that allocation process to understand what those funding amounts would be, understand it's helpful to have something to react to. I think potentially we could discuss what that looks like. As we've discussed, Gresham's programs there was funding added back last year to their programming. So I would be really interested for us to keep talking as a group what it looks like to fund East County and Gresham. We are committed to funding those programs in Gresham and East County cities. The reason you don't have an amount to react to and there isn't a specific program offer is because they are part of that larger reallocation. But that larger reallocation does not put the fact of them being funded at risk. It's just the amount, as we take big reductions across our programming, is not yet set.
Understood. Okay. Well, I will be passing out an amendment to ensure that we remain the current funding, and then also a budget note that we explore just a IGA and just the funding for outreach in East Multnomah County. So thank you. Thank you for that clarification.
All right, thank you all so much. Thank you for the comprehensive presentation of what we've been able to cover so far. I will say, so we'll have you back probably about 2 p.m. tomorrow afternoon. And then tomorrow we start jumping into our health department presentations in the morning. So we look forward to hearing from the health department and having homeless services back. I did want to say, are there any other amendments or budget notes that people are going to drop today?
Yeah, I have and this is attached to amendment number 6 that budget amendment number 6 that I introduced last week. I mentioned it relates to pretrial, and I mentioned that there would be a framework attached to it. So this is the one for Christian. This is the framework.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone. That concludes today's budget work session. Our next meeting will be our budget work session number 7, scheduled for tomorrow, Wednesday, May 6th at 9 a.m. There being no further business, we are adjourned.